All right, look at that. All right, let's see if your numbers go up or drop.
Wonderful. Well, we're starting at six, so I'm sure it'll go up. I wanted to start off today. I'm going to use a minor expletive here. Why the hell is the Air Force testing a Minuteman ballistic missile, a Minuteman 3, I believe specifically? The world is well aware that the U.S. has a large nuclear arsenal. They don't need to show that right now. It's obviously only an escalatory move. You know what I mean? I feel like it brings us closer to nuclear annihilation rather than farther. So what in whatever general's mind, in Joe Biden's mind, whoever made the decision, what are they thinking?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you with the optics of it. It's not a good time to be testing this. No, but Russia recently tested its own nuclear arsenal, um, and I think the Russian tests were clearly designed to send a signal that hey NATO, hey America, let's just remind you who we are and what the consequences of crossing any red line would be. On this test, the U.S. has postponed this test for some time now, and having been peripherally involved in the testing, I used to do START treaty compliance work, and so one of the issues of the START treaty, the Strategic Arm Reduction Treaty, is notifications of testing, et cetera. So I had to work with the Air Force, and I got educated on what goes into testing. And it's not something that's done. You can't turn it on and off. There's a testing cycle. There's the tests aren't done just randomly. There's a variety of sensors that are involved to check on the quality of the overall missile system to make sure everything's working the way it should. It's not just an operational test of the personnel, and it's a quality control test too for the inventory. So it's important that it's done. So I'm going to push back a little bit and say that this test had been postponed to the point that where if it had been postponed more, they were going to lose the test. And from the perspective of making sure that an aging fleet is reliable, losing the test at this point in time probably wasn't the wisest thing to do. They notified the Russians that this test was coming. I think they sent every signal in the world possible saying, we're doing this test, we're doing this test, this isn't a threat, this is a test. And I think the Russians are mature enough to understand exactly what's going on. The Russians knew that this test has been canceled in the past, primarily because the United States didn't want to be seen as being unnecessarily provocative. Now, but now I'm going to say that I think there are many in the Biden administration said it's not just time to do this test for all the reasons I just said, but we need to send a signal too. We're here. We got this capability. We're not to be trifled with. So yeah, it's this is the problem with nuclear weapons, because they are the ultimate. I have to be careful what I say here, but they're it's the equivalent of men unzipping their pants and pulling it out. Who's got it? It's just stupidity in the extreme. It doesn't need to happen. We don't need these weapons. These weapons exist with the knowledge that if we ever use them, the world ends. What kind of insane society engages in this practice? We should be talking about nuclear arms reduction. And yet we're talking about modernizing the entire fleet. One of the reasons why this test has to take place is that the Minuteman III system is an old, aging system. And one of the big decisions right now that is being made is do we need a new missile system? The answer is if we're going to have land-based missiles, we need a new missile. The Minuteman III can't be upgraded anymore. It doesn't make any sense. There's some people who say, well, we could do a complete revision of the missile. Well, that's a complete revision of the missile. New boosters, new second stage, new third stage, new post-boost vehicle. So they're talking about building this new missile. I think it's called the Sentinel. the ground-based deterrent system or something of that nature. It's going to, the price tag, and people are saying, it's going to be 200, $300 billion to do it all. Since when has an American military procurement system ever stayed on budget? Let's just take the F-35 fighter, for example, to watch a system that spiraled out of control. The fact is, there's not a single modern system today that hasn't spiraled out of control. That's built into the defense industry's business model. They know that once the Congress has allocated funds, once the decision has been made in the Pentagon to acquire this system, that the defense industry owns America, because we're not going to back out. Very rarely do we back out. I think the last time we did it significantly was for the Crusader self-propelled artillery system. But that was just a piece of junk that we're building. They should have backed out of the F-35, but they didn't. The F-22 probably should have been backed out of, but they didn't. They're not going to back out of this new triad that we're building, because it's not just the Sentinel ICBM, it's the B-21 Raider, new stealth bomber. It's the I forget the new Columbia class ballistic missile submarine that's going to require an upgraded Trident, whatever number they want to put after it. We're going to spend literally probably more than $1 trillion by the time this is done. $1 trillion. Now, most Americans are probably a little jaundiced right now because, after all, didn't we just spend $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan over the course of 20 years? We spent $1 trillion before. It's just a number anymore. But if you take a look at the infrastructure bill that Joe Biden was trying to push through, the original one, people were complaining about the price tag. Well, wouldn't it have been nice to say, hey, we can pay for this by not modernizing a nuclear force that we're going to actually work and to negotiate to get rid of? We don't need nuclear weapons. They serve no let me put it this way. Did nuclear weapons stop Russia from invading Ukraine? The answer is hell no. Are nuclear weapons going to stop China from invading Taiwan? The answer is hell no. The bottom line is nations are going to do that which is required for their existential survival, regardless. Nuclear weapons aren't going to stop anything. All nuclear weapons are there is to prevent the other side from using nuclear weapons against you. They don't change overall behavior, unless you're North Korea, because now North Korea has come out, thanks to Joe Biden failing to follow up on the opportunity provided, the unfulfilled opportunity provided by the Trump administration regarding denuclearization talks. North Korea's come out and just said, screw it. You guys don't want to work with us? Fine. We hereby bless the entire North Korean nuclear fleet as being permanent. Not just permanent, but we will use it preemptively to nuke everybody if we think you're coming after us. That sort of changes the calculus dramatically. But that doesn't mean that the North Koreans and the South Koreans aren't going to spar a little bit. It just means that there's not going to be any regime change activity undertaken by the United States and South Korea towards North Korea, because the second we try to do that, North Korea makes Seoul, makes Tokyo, makes Yokohama. Hell, why not? Just get Hiroshima and Nagasaki again. Finish the job. Take out Guam, hit San Francisco, LA, and maybe all the missiles aren't going to hit their target, but enough of them will, and it will be a nuclear ruin. And then what? What do we do? Pour 400 nukes into North Korea? Yay. What have we proven? Nothing. Nuclear weapons are literally the dumbest thing mankind has ever done. Literally, because it's a suicide pill. But now we come back to the Minuteman III. Why do we need to test it? What is the Minuteman III? Let's just think about it for a second. There are about 400 of these things. They're in silos in the middle of America. They're older systems. They're pretty accurate, but not as accurate as the Trident. They take a long time to fly there. They might be vulnerable to ballistic missile systems, anti-ballistic missile systems. But and when people tried to defend it, they said by having 400 Minutemen in their silos, we force any enemy who's going to attack America to send at least 800 missiles into what they call a missile sump. So the Minuteman force exists only to to attract 800 missiles to strike middle America. Now, if I'm a farmer in North Dakota, do I really want to be rah rah ba about this? No, it's stupidity. So we build nuclear weapons simply to attract enemy nuclear weapons. Again, this is real. I'm not making this up. Say missile sump, stupidity. And we're going to spend $1 trillion to accomplish this task? Dumb. In submarines, they're everybody talks about the security of the submarine. And I don't want to get, too sensitive here. Let me put it this way. Submarines are big. You know what else is big that swims under the ocean's water? Whales. And we can detect whales anytime we want to. And I'm not going to give away the farm here. I'm just trying to tell you that giant steel whales cannot hide under the water. So any notion that we can put a boom around the ocean and no one will know about it is stupidity defined. They are tracking the boomers. They're the number one priority target. And the idea that they're going to be able to launch their missiles without any potential interdiction is stupid. And then the B-21 bomber. Why do we need it? What to penetrate what? If you think that stealth exists today, you don't know anything about modern air defense systems. There is no such thing as stealth anymore. Nothing is stealth. It can be stealthy, but it's not stealth. So we're going to put all this money into a bomber that is ridiculous. In Afghanistan, we had B-2 bombers flying over Afghanistan, dropping these satellite-guided munitions. You know what else was dropping satellite-guided munitions? B-52 bombers that were built before I was born, and I'm an old son of a gun. So, and the B-52 is actually a better delivery system than the B-2. The B-2 is a huge waste of money. It brings no value to any aspect of America's defense. No bomber is going to penetrate Soviet airspace, or Russian airspace, I should say. Probably not Chinese airspace either, which means we're going to be using standoff weapons. So we don't need a stealth bomber to fire a standoff weapon. But we're going to spend $1 trillion doing it because America's married to the triad, the three-legged nuclear deterrence model. And that's just a long way of answering your question. Yeah, it's probably a provocative test.
Well, you also have the W762 low-yield weapons, which those also increase the chance of a nuclear conflict.
They're designed to increase the chance of war. That's the amazing thing. Where for the longest time, the United States said, we don't intend to use nuclear weapons first. It's not really what we want to do. We had Obama starting to back away from it. Then comes Donald Trump, and Donald Trump green lights the deployment of. In all fairness to Trump, the warhead was being developed before him. But he comes in and he says, not only is it a good idea to put the W76-2 low-yield nuclear warhead on a Trident missile on an Ohio-class submarine, but why don't we go ahead and test it in a war game that has the Secretary of Defense pushing the damn button, authorizing the launch against, let's see what we could do that could be the most provocative. We'll just call it Russia, a scenario that involves Russia engaged with NATO in the Baltics. So we're going to launch a nuclear weapon as part of our escalate to de-escalate policy, which we claim the Russians have, but we're the only ones who've implemented it and tested it. So we're going to nuke Russia, and in hopes that Russia says, oh my God, you nuked me, we're going to back off. The W76-2 low-yield nuclear weapon was specifically designed to give the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, a wider range of options regarding the employment of nuclear weapons in any possible scenario, including preemption in a non-nuclear reality, meaning it's not preempt to stop enemy from nuking, it's preempting in a conventional sense. It is one of the most destabilizing weapons that exists in the world today. It's deployed, it's on systems, and Biden has not backed away from that policy. If anything, he's doubled down on it.
On the campaign trail, he talked a little bit about being against it, if you remember. So did Kamala Harris when she was in the Senate. She spoke out against it. Why do you think? Right. What?
Politicians' lips move in campaign trails. Don't believe what comes out.
Yeah.
Because here's what happened when you're campaigning. When you're campaigning, you're seeking to win a vote. So you're saying whatever it takes to get the gullible citizen into the poll booth to pull the lever. But once you become president, the reality is what Vladimir Putin spoke about in an interview he gave a little while ago. He says you can say all the great things in the world. He said Obama said he wanted to close Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay. But what happened? He said men show up in dark suits and blue ties or red ties, and I think he said red ties. He's wearing a blue tie, and they sit down and they give you the real brief, what really is happening, what the real policy is, and it's called the establishment. People call it the deep state, whatever you call it. There is this reality of constancy in American policy, domestic and foreign and national security, that's driven by a huge system that has no relevance and no response and no connection to the American electorate. So we elect politicians, they come in, they want to make change. The system doesn't budge at all. And Biden started talking about, the nuclear weapons, said he wasn't happy with a low yield nuclear weapon. He wanted to talk about disarmament. And then the system came in and they tied his hands up. And that doesn't mean that Biden can't, or any president can't go against the system, but you really want to be expending all of your political bullets on that when your number one priority was, build back better or some other concept. So the system makes it very, very hard for the executive to meaningfully deviate off the chosen path. And the chosen path is not chosen by the executive. It's chosen by the system, the establishment, the deep state, whatever you want to call it. It's real, it exists, and it dominates. Is that a cat?
It was, yeah. I find it very interesting that Biden even spoke about it on the campaign trail. I can't imagine most Americans have ever even heard of a W762 low yield weapon,
I think he was trying to create distance between himself and Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Biden was sort of on his back heels because Trump, he's not a constant. There's no consistency with him. He withdrew us from the INF Treaty. He drew from the JCPOA, but he visited with Kim Jong-un 3 times. So I think Biden was feeling a little bit of pressure as to being seen as being an innovator in arms control to match, Donald Trump's really good relationship with Kim Jong-un.
Well, not just Kim Jong Un, but he met with Putin, he met with Xi, and both he was diplomatic with both of them. Biden, on the other hand, met with Putin, and he said he stared him in the eye and called him
a killer, cold-hearted killer.
Yeah. So who really is being more de-escalatory is the question there. I wanted to move to Ukraine and Russia now. And obviously, Ukraine had their recent counteroffensives. Everybody is aware of that by now. I believe you were on, I forget her name, but you were on somebody's show and you said that you believe that the Kherson offensive, was a fixing attack or sort of a feint. I kind of wanted to ask you to elaborate on that because to me, it seemed like it was just another offensive like they did at Kharkov, but this time the Russian forces defended and it just failed. But you seem to believe that it was designed to be more of a feint in order to open up Kharkov.
Well, again, let's just start with the fundamental premise that I have not received the official briefing from Vladimir Putin or Shoigu or Gerasimov or anybody. I don't know anything. So I'm like everybody else who's looking at this from long distance, trying to figure out what happened. So, in the intelligence business, let's use a little analogy here. At Christmas time, you go out, you always buy grandpa the 1,000 piece puzzle because it's a pretty picture and it gives grandpa something to do in the cold winter because he can't go outside. So he spends all winter putting 1,000 pieces together to build this big puzzle. Yay. The intelligence business is taking that 1,000 piece puzzle and removing 700 pieces at random. shaking up the remaining 300, throwing it down, and telling them, "Tell me what the picture is." And then you're sitting there, and sometimes, if you do things right, you can gather a couple more pieces. But a lot of times, the situation changes and they start removing pieces from your board, and you still have to tell them what the picture looks like. Um, and that's what's going on when we're looking at Ukraine today. We have a puzzle that is incomplete. Sometimes mid-picture, they change the picture and just throw in different pieces, and you still have to move around, try and figure out what's going on. So I say that as a long way of saying, the conversation we're about to have is speculation.
Yeah,
Speculation, but speculation. So, I'm not going to put my bayonet in the rifle, put the rifle in the ground, say I'm dying on this hill. As more information comes in, I might go, "Whoa, I was wrong about that." And then we'll move in. I'm a guy with a modicum of integrity. I have no problem saying I was wrong. But what it looks like to me right now is that Russia had been, first of all, we have to understand that there's a 200,000 man cap approximately. Only the Russian Ministry of Defense knows what the actual cap is, but there's an upper limit on the number of troops that Russia is willing to deploy at one time in Ukraine. And that's defined by not only the orders and decisions of the Russian leadership, but also by the four corners framed out by the special military operation itself, meaning that there's certain legal issues involved with how you use forces, how you can get forces released to this, et cetera, et cetera. And there's only so much you could do with 200,000 troops. And I think Russia, initially phase one was designed to sort of be a shock and awe campaign that, maybe intimidated the Ukrainians into surrendering. And if it didn't, at least at a minimum, shape the battlefield so that Donbass would be taken, because Russia's coming in with 200,000, Ukraine's defending with 260,000 regulars, another 700,000 reservists. That's 960,000 to 200,000. The attacker to defender ratio is supposed to be 3-1 in favor of the attacker. It's literally close to 1-4 against the Russians. So the Russians are trying to do some maneuver warfare stuff to win the war quickly, or to shape the battle so that they can achieve the primary objective of capturing the Donbass by freezing Ukrainian troops in place, diverting reinforcements elsewhere, etc. So the Russians did this little maneuver warfare game. Then they come down to phase two. In order to do phase two, they had to withdraw a lot of troops from around Kiev and from around Kharkov. They withdrew them and brought them in and redeployed them as part of what remained of the effort, which was to secure the Kherson bridgehead out of Crimea, to create a land bridge connecting Kherson and Crimea with the Donbass and with the Russian Federation, to capture Mariupol, which was a big deal, to destroy the Azov regiment in Mariupol, which was a big deal, and to begin the process of liberating Lugansk and Donetsk. In order to secure Lugansk, the northern portion, Russia was compelled to move into Kharkov Oblast province, and to move on Kharkov itself, and to threaten Kharkov. Again, one of the ideas of threatening Kharkov is to force the Ukrainians to divert troops up there and keep them away from the main fight down in Donbass. So the Russians are doing somewhat of a diversionary fixing attack, full-time basis in Kharkov. Over the course of the summer, Russia was accomplishing its primary objective. That was to, first of all, they recaptured all of Lugansk, and then they were making significant progress in the Donetsk People's Republic. But they're going up against some prepared defenses that have been, the Ukrainians have been digging in for 8 years. So every village, every town, every field, every wood strip, everything is just dug in, trench line, bunkers, everything. And it takes a long time to reduce these down, because the Russian goal is to liberate, inflict maximum casualties on Ukrainians, but here's the very important part: minimize casualties for the Russians. So they're doing that, and they're doing that with great success. The casualty ratios that are coming out during the summer, were 10, 15-1 on occasion. I mean, it's just ridiculous how the Russians are doing this. But there was another thing happening, and I talked about this in May. I did an interview with a guy named Garland Nixon. He's a radio personality here in the United States, well known, well respected. And Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, was on with me. And I brought up the Lend-Lease program policy that the United States Congress was getting ready to pass, and Biden said he was going to sign. And we're talking that, it represented at that time around $53 billion worth of military assistance and other assistance, on top of the money that's already been given to them, and on top of the money that Europe and NATO had been providing. And then you combine this new weaponry coming in with the strategic depth that NATO was providing to allow Ukrainian forces to leave Ukraine, go to Europe, get trained without fear of any attack, and then come in with new equipment. As Russia was grinding down the Ukrainian army, and let's just be honest, Russia defeated the Ukrainian army this summer. They literally destroyed the vast majority of the existing Ukrainian arsenal of weaponry, their tanks, their artillery, their armored vehicles, their air force, all destroyed. They ground down their active forces. There was talk of, some people talk of between 191 to 250,000 casualties that Ukraine suffered. So Russia beat the Ukrainian army. So anybody who said that 200,000 Russian troops was insufficient to the task of defeating the Ukrainian army was wrong. The Russians did it. It's a done deal. But the NATO reconstituted the Ukrainian force. And that's what we saw in September. We saw a new reality is around 30 to 40,000 fresh Ukrainian troops, organized, trained, equipped, led, commanded, given intelligence by NATO. Now, prior to this counteroffensive that we're talking about, I think it would be safe to say that Ukraine had a military that was trained and equipped by NATO. But the military that carried out the counteroffensive was a NATO army manned primarily, but not exclusively, by Ukrainians. And that's a qualitative difference. So we have a completely qualitatively different force coming in to carry out this attack. Now, why September? Phase 2 started in around March 25th. And the first part of phase 2 involved the primary focus was on the capture of Mariupol, completion of the land bridge. And, that went through April, that got into May, but they finally accomplished that task. And then the troops that were involved in that moved on to carry out attacks, in Lugansk and Donbass. They had to expand and defend the Kherson bridgehead. And the point I'm trying to make is that there's a little bit of a pause from phase 1 to phase 2, but not much. But let's just say from April, May, June, July, August. I'm a Marine, so I have to do that. April, May, June, July, 5 months. Hey, I'm pretty good. If it was 6, I'd have trouble. I'd have to use 2 hands. 5 months. There's not a military in the world that can sustain offensive operations for 5 months. Check out history. It doesn't work that way. Check out the recent American invasion of Iraq in 2003. We had to pause before Baghdad. They call it the Karbala pause. We moved up. Why did we have to pause? We outran our ammunition. We ran out of fuel. We had to stop and have everything catch up so that we could have fuel and ammunition. Because what happens to tanks when they move forward, they run out of gas? They stop being tanks and they start becoming coffins. So, even the vaunted American military, after a few weeks, had to pause to refit, refuel, re-equip. It wasn't a big pause, but we had to take a pause. The Russians were doing this heavy fighting. You don't engage in combat that kills 500 to 1,000 enemy a day. Let's put it another way. The Russians were firing 60,000 artillery rounds a day. During all of Desert Storm, the United States fired 60,000 rounds. So right off the bat, 60,000 rounds means you have a lot of artillerymen doing a lot of work every single day. The infantry, historically, the number of small arms rounds that have to be fired to achieve a casualty, it fluctuates, but it's in the thousands. You have to fire thousands of rounds before one bullet hits target. So just think about it. If you're killing, 500 to 1,000 Ukrainians a day, that means you're also wounding, three times that many. Um, the amount of action going on, the amount of shooting, the amount of artillery, combat that's going on is intense, hugely intense. And combat is stressful. Stressful. I mean, you are literally stressed out the whole time. Guys are nicotine fit freaks. They're drinking coffee. They're not getting any sleep. Their eyes are red. Just, you want to know what combat's like? Get some sand, put it in your eye, and rub it. Okay, and there it is. And then stay awake for like 3 days, listen to the loudest music possible, um, and do push-ups and sit-ups. Go sit in the rain, pour cold water on yourself, sit in front of a fan from the air conditioning, freezing. Do anything that just makes your life hell, and you do that for 24 hours, and you've experienced 1 day of combat. These guys have done it for 5 months on both sides. I mean, I'm not minimizing what the Ukrainians are doing. They're the ones getting killed. But my point is, you have to hit pause for a second. Even the vaunted Chechens, Mr. Tough Guys, oh, the big chested Chechens out there, and I'm not making fun of them. I admire them. Even the Chechens had to hit pause. They sent all their guys home for 30-day break, and that's what happened in July. Russia went, we got to hit pause. We've been pushing these guys too hard. Pause, 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 pause. And then during the pause, Russia said, while we rest and regroup, we need to prepare for the autumn offensive. So while we pause, we're going to pull some units out of the front line, get them re-equipped, reorganized. We're going to build these new battle groups ready to launch this attack, etc. This means that you've lost your initiative. In combat. It's I know I'm throwing a lot of things out here. I hope I'm not confusing you at all, but you know John Boyd. You've heard of John Boyd, Colonel
Yes.
John Boyd, Air Force guy, fighter pilot. I forget what they called him, 32nd Boyd or 13-second Boyd, whatever. But he basically said, put me in an airplane, put you in an airplane, fly each other's nose to nose. And once we hit break, I'll shoot you down in X amount of seconds. Because he would initiate a series of maneuvers that were designed to have you reacting to him every time. And once you started reacting to him, he would get into a position where he could shoot you down 100% of the time. And it's called the OODA loop, orient, let's see, OODA. Observe, there it is, the first O. Observe, orient, decide, act. In maneuver warfare, the Marine Corps adopted OODA loop and the Boyd's theory in our maneuver warfare thing. I was part of that. I was very proud of being part of the intellectual time, a great intellectual time of the Marine Corps where maneuver warfare was brought in. But one of the things is you want to get inside your opponent's decision-making loop, their OODA loop, decision-making cycle. If you can execute the OODA loop tighter, in a tighter circle than your opponent, they will always be reacting to you. And then, like Boyd said, maneuver, 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 they're done. Russia owned the OODA loop for the summer of 2022. They owned it. And then they hit pause. That's the danger of a pause. Because when you hit pause, the OODA loop resets. And whatever advantage you had, whatever spin you were getting, you lost it. And now that doesn't mean you can't regain it, but that's what Russia was trying to do by resting, reequipping, etc. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, remember, now we have to stop talking about Ukraine. NATO, on the other, because that's who's now fighting this fight. This is a NATO war against Russia, 100%. They're using Ukraine as a de facto NATO army. In fact, Ukraine is a NATO army today, a NATO military. It's more NATO than virtually any other NATO force. And it's better than any other NATO force. Let me just make this point. Those 30,000 Ukrainian troops that they just put on the battlefield to beat their head against the Russian defenses and took over Kharkov, if you took those 30,000, put them up against 30,000 Germans, they'd wipe the board on Germany. Put them up against 30,000 French. French wouldn't stand a chance. There's not a single military in NATO, with the possible exception of the United States, that could stand toe-to-toe with the Ukrainian military, this new Ukrainian military, and win. That's how good these guys are. They're good. They're combat hardened. You never know until you actually go to combat how you're going to perform in combat. Germany might have some really tough guys, but I think they're pretty soft. I think they've been eating a lot of Wiener Schnitzel, drinking a lot of beer, schnapps. They enjoy going to the what do they call it? The beer, the
Beer garden?
Beer garden, the name of their bars, Wire, the Hoff or something like that. But again, I'm getting old and senile. But they enjoy their life. They're not hard troops. They're not. They're soft. The French troops, they got some hard guys. Most of the French guys are soft. The British, they're pretty hard, but their military is just pathetic. It's shrinking to the point of it's like Benjamin Button. Um, you know, there's nobody who has a hard military. Even the United States is becoming increasingly soft because we've lost whatever edge we had from combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Ukrainians are all hard. They're 100% hard. So are the Russians, by the way. But my point is, this is a very good military with very good intelligence. They have the totality of NATO's intelligence. And here's the other point: NATO gets to operate its intelligence collection platforms without fear of any interdiction. In combat, that intelligence satellite we have floating right over Ukraine, taking all the happy snaps they want 24/7, wouldn't work. I'm just telling you right now, if NATO actually went to war against Russia today, all of these systems would shut down. Most of them would be destroyed, or the other ones would just be jammed. Other ones would never get off the airfield. So NATO has this, they're living in this fantasy world where they're getting the perfect intelligence picture because Russia can't do anything to stop them. So the Ukraine army is getting perfect intelligence about the Russian order of battle, everything. So the NATO army now / Ukraine knows the Russians have hit an operational pause. They know Russia has withdrawn certain forces. They have the complete layout of the battlefield. And so now they also are aware of Russian doctrine. I mean, you know that the Russians, when they defend, they're supposed to defend over a certain frontage. They're supposed to defend in depth. There's certain identified reserves that will respond to any counterattack, etc. And so when they look down, they say, here's the system. What do we need to do? The number one, if you evaluate, there's 3 primary fronts that you have to talk about here: Kharkov, Donbass, and then Kherson. Of the 3, which one poses an existential threat to the Russian posture? It's Kherson. If you take Kherson, you threaten Crimea. End of story. Kherson must be held at all costs by the Russians. They can't give it up. So over the summer, while Ukraine was building up their forces, remember Zelensky, I got a 1 million-man army. We're coming to Kherson. We're going to drive through and take Crimea. Everybody talked about Kherson. We're going to take Kherson. Don't hold that referendum in Kherson. We're coming to get you. Crimea, you belong to us. We're coming to get you. And so the Russians responded to that, and they kept Kherson pretty well defended. The first Ukrainian, the initial Ukrainian offensive operations were against Kherson. Now, there's a difference between a feint and a diversionary attack. A feint is, if we're boxing, I'm going to feint. I'm going to try and get you to, I'm going to fake a punch. You're going to move, and then I'm going to come in. I'm going to feint, hit you, feint, back. But a diversion is, I'm just going to come in and start beating the crap out of you. Boom, 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 boom. I'm going to get you to totally focus on me. And then someone else is going to come in from behind and knock you out. But it doesn't work that way in boxing, so it's not a perfect analogy. But the point is, the feint, you don't commit. The diversion, you commit. And the Ukrainians did a diversion attack for the purpose of fixing the Russians in place in Kherson, and by pressing home the attack, because the important thing about a fixing attack or diversion attack, it has to be believable. If you're just in there tickling somebody, they're not going to believe that you're actually coming in to bear hug them and strangle them. And the Ukrainians made it believable. They committed to the attack. They came in hard, and they lost a lot of guys. Some people, we don't know what the true casualty figures are yet because the Ukrainians aren't releasing them. The Russians aren't releasing, proof. The Russians say on the first day 1,700 dead. Probably a little bit exaggerated, but not too much. I mean, you can count destroyed vehicles, and nowadays the Russians have drones overhead and they're taking photographs and they can count the bodies. And so I'm not going to say that's too exaggerated. I think the Russians are closer to the truth than not. What we do know is that the Ukrainians had to have basically an endless line of ambulances taking the wounded and injured out of the battlefield, thousands. But the Ukrainians pressed the attack. They attacked. They didn't stop. They kept pressing the attack, up to the point that the commander in Kherson said, I need reinforcements. And the Russians went, released the reinforcements. And the strategic reinforcements were released. They come in to Kherson and they commit to the fight. So now we have a classic fixing attack. You've attacked the existing defense. The reserves come in. Now you fix them. You grab them and you hold them close. And it's tough, man. You're getting bleed, you're getting cut, whatever, but you hold them. The Russians can't go anywhere right now. They're fixed. And in military terms, that sets up another F word that we're not going to use. You fix them, you find them, you fix them, and then you finish them off. And now the Ukrainians release the Kraken, so to speak. I don't know how large it was, 20,000 troops that they used up north, but they release them. And they release them having evaluated, because Kharkov was the weakest link. I talked about Kherson being the first. The Donbass was the second. Donbass is politically important. You want to liberate. That's what this whole war was fought about, to defend these people, liberate these people. Plus, the Russians are continuing the offensive here. There's a group called Wagner, and they never stopped attacking. Everybody else on the front line said, we have to hit a pause. And Wagner said, stick the pause where the sun don't shine. Keep going, boys. Keep going. And it's a different quality, a different, qualitatively, psychologically, a different group of people is Wagner. They're professional contract soldiers. They work for the Russian Ministry of Defense, the general staff, but they're not regular army, so to speak. They're contract. Russia has a military system that's based on the combined. You have conscripts, and then you have contract soldiers. In the United States, we call contract soldiers volunteers. But the Russian contract system is different from the American volunteer system. We get people to volunteer, they're raw recruits, etc. Most contract soldiers have already been through basic training. They were conscripted at one point. Some of them stayed on for several years. They already did a contract in the paratroops or whatever. And they come back and they sign a contract for a fixed period of time based upon their skill and experience. But when you sign up with the airborne unit or with an armor unit, there's legal constraints that the Russian government has on how they can use it. Wagner is designed to be a contract vehicle without legal constraint. And so it's uniquely funded, but it's a unique Russian entity. A lot of people are saying, well, it's like Blackwater. Not at all. Blackwater, you can't win the Congressional Medal of Honor if you're working. You're a civilian, private military contractor, but you're not in the U.S. Army. Wagner guys get Russian state awards for heroism that are designated only for the military all the time because they are military. It's just a different contract vehicle. These Wagner boys, they're down there, they're fighting, they're hooking and jabbing. They don't stop. It's just a different mindset for these guys. So the Russians are continuing this offensive in the Donbass. Even during the pause, they're still grinding away. But Kharkov up north, they went into full complacent mode. They just went, we're hitting pause, we're pulling out some. Up north, they had two of the elite offensive formations in the Russian military, the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 20th Combined Arms Army. These are organizations with long and glorious history dating back to the Second World War. They were involved in the final assault on Berlin, killing the Nazi beast. During the Cold War, they were in East Germany. These were the vanguard of the Soviet forces that would drive through and take the Rhine. And then when the Cold War ended, they were withdrawn, and Russia went through that period where they redefined their military, reorganized their military to focus more on the brigade than the division or corps, because nobody believed there was going to be a large ground war in Europe anymore. So they went to the brigade size, et cetera. But around 2016, the Russians realized that NATO, there was a possibility they'd be fighting NATO. So they reconstituted these formations. They are purpose designed to fight NATO. They only exist to fight NATO. That's all they're supposed to do, which means they're designed to receive the NATO attack, halt the NATO attack, and then launch a counterattack that destroys the NATO attack. That's the doctrine. Trust me, I just spent the whole week refamiliarizing myself with Russian doctrine. I've got all the old FMFMs, and this thick. I read them from top to bottom. My eyes hurt, just to make sure that I'm right when I talk about this, because but that's what these two units do. They haven't been allowed to do their job. I mean, the special military operation put some constraints on them. They were involved in the feint on Kiev. They'd been up in Kharkiv, um, and they actually didn't perform very well. There's some of the regiments, got in head-on engagement with the Ukrainians, came out on the losing end, losing equipment and men. There's been some questions about these two units, probably because they've never been allowed to be employed doctrinally. I mean, it's again, I don't like to bring up boxing too much. But if I fight with a left foot forward stance, and I train, and someone says, okay, time for the match, right foot forward. What? I don't do right foot forward. I mean, this is supposed to be my jab. Now this is my jab. I haven't practiced that. And that's sort of what happened to them. They had to shift their whole way, and it doesn't work. But they can defend. I mean, that's not a problem. When a Russian unit defends the division, and there's 3 divisions in each one of these things, that's 6 divisions, as a 20-kilometer frontage. Depending on, terrain will dictate, but generally speaking, it's about 20-kilometer frontage for a division. And they break it up, and then there's about 15 to 20 kilometers in depth. So you pretty much have a 20-kilometer by 20-kilometer box. That is a division. And so when you have the army, it's sort of the equivalent of a NATO corps. You'll have 3 of those. You're not going to put all 3 on front because you have to have 1 division in reserve. You always have a reserve. So 2 on front, you're talking 40-kilometer thing with the 20th combiner, 80 kilometers of this. So you need more forces. But my point is, that's how they're doing. But it's too big of a frontage, not enough troops. So you start spreading things out. Now, that's okay if you got all your artillery. And believe me, these combined arms army have a lot of artillery. And so, because the artillery, they form what they call fire kettles. That's the space between strong points. You put out obstacles. The enemy comes in. The idea with your obstacle plan, your defense plan, is to channel them in, and then they get destroyed with artillery. Doctrinally, it works great. And after you disrupt them, then the reserves come in, pinch off them from the back, and kill them all. Doctrine's amazing. It looks great on paper all the time. Every time I do a PowerPoint presentation based upon doctrine, I win. But the reality changes that. These guys lost a lot of their troops to be reorganized, re-equipped. They created giant gaps, and they normally, let's say I have a Marine rifle battalion on the front lines. It's time to replace it. I want to replace them with something like a Marine rifle battalion, even if it's an Army rifle battalion. That's okay. Army rifle battalion. National Guard rifle battalion. Okay, I can even use a National Guard rifle battalion because they're sort of the same thing. LAPD SWAT team ain't the same thing. Rifle battalion, SWAT team, not the same thing. I mean, Sesame Street could put on a show about one of these things is not like the other, and the SWAT team is the one that jumps out and says, we're not like anybody else because we're not designed, equipped, organized, trained, carry out combat operations on the front line, the forward edge of the battle area where enemy tanks and artillery and armored personnel vehicles are going to be hitting us first. That's what the Russians did. They put SWAT teams on the front line. They put militia units on the front line. They put Interior Ministry troops on the front line. And not only that, they didn't do it doctrinally. So the gap between these hard points was made longer. Sometimes it was 5 kilometers between one strong point and the other. And then that whole defense in depth thing I talked about, they didn't do it. So 20 kilometers behind the SWAT team, there's nothing, 0 empty space. That's okay, because the Russians have all that artillery. They'll just suck them into the empty space and blow the crap out of them, except all the artillery's gone because they've taken it to Donbass so they can achieve that 10 to 15 to 1 superiority as they grind them down in the defense. There was nothing there. And NATO, with their perfect intelligence, knew this. They knew everything. So when they attacked at the point of greatest weakness, the SWAT team, this LAPD SWAT team, except they weren't LAPD, they were from Ufa, I think Samara. I'm not making facts. I'm going to talk very well of these guys in a second, but they're SWAT. they're special police. And they attacked there. They were going to shoot around these guys, get in the rear, and then start attacking command and control, logistics, artillery, ammunition, and all that. And it worked, except one problem for the Ukrainians. SWAT didn't cooperate. You see, SWAT was supposed to give up. So I was supposed to die. But the boys in the SWAT team said, the hell with you. We're putting the bayonet in the ground right here and we're fighting and dying on this piece of terrain. And they did, except they didn't die. They killed a lot of Ukrainians. They broke up the initial attack, channeled them around, and they held out. These are some of the bravest men ever. I mean, when the awards list comes out, the day they do the awards ceremony for that unit, I think the chest carrying the medals is going to require 10 guys to hold. And the general is going to have to lift weights for a month beforehand because his arms are going to get tired picking up this hardware and putting on the chest of these heroes. These guys deserve any award they get. But they were surrounded, and if they weren't rescued, they were going to die. That's the whole thing. In Moscow, 1941, Battle of Moscow, when the Russians finally launched their counterattack, Hitler ordered the German army to dig in, no retreat. Dig in, form these little fortresses, whatever. If you're a company, dig in. A battalion, dig in. A regiment, dig in. You just dig in, make this fortified position, and you hold on at all costs. And the Russians came in, and some of these they destroyed. They killed all the Germans. Other ones, the Germans held out. And eventually, by digging in like this, it broke up the Russian attack. It's paused, and then the Germans were able to consolidate the defense. And so the defeat was far less than if the Germans had retreated back, lost all that territory. But they lost a lot of Germans doing it. The Russians could have done the same thing. The Russian high command could have woke up and said, Ukraine's broken through. All the boys in the front line will write nice letters to your mom about you, but you're going to die. Dig in, kill as many as you can. Goodbye, до свидания. And they would have done it because they're soldiers. They will fight and die if they have to. They could have done that. They could have made hard points, tell them to dig out, then bring in their reserves, fight immediate engagement with the Ukrainians, hooking and jabbing, and hope that you're able to gain the superiority and drive them back, or at least blunt them while you build a defense. You're going to lose a lot of Russians doing that, a lot of Russians. The Russians made the decision, I believe, turns out to be the right decision, that they're not going to sacrifice their most precious resource. So while the Ukrainians are running rampant in the Russian rear, the Russians counterattack, but instead of trying to blunt the Ukrainian attack, they drove in and rescued these units, these militia units, National Guard units, the SWAT team. They rescued them and they extracted them. They got them out. And then they just said, we're not going to do this whole von Manstein, 1943 Kharkov campaign with Kolpov's tank army, and we're going to push each other around and everybody's going to die. We're not playing that game. We're getting the hell out of Dodge. We're falling back to a readily defensible position on the Oxel River, and we're going to consolidate our lines, and the Ukrainians can have Kharkov Oblast. We're done with it. And they did that. When you look at the map, it's very dramatic because one day there's a lot of red, and the next day it's all blue. Not the next day, but the next couple of days, it's all blue. What happened here? This was a major defeat for Russia. Anybody who tries, there's people out there spinning it saying, oh, the Russians are playing 5D chess, baby. These Russians, they trick Ukrainians in, they suck them into the trap, and let me say, let's say we just didn't describe any of that battle, and I start off with this. Hey, Bradley, over the last week, there was a lot of fighting in Kharkov. Ukraine lost around 2,500 troops. The Russians lost about 200. Who won the battle?
And well, it sounds like the Russians.
Sounds like the Russians won it. Well, that's the problem. You see, Ukraine won what I call a Pyrrhic victory. They achieved this great territorial grab. And believe me, it's a political victory. When Zelensky gets to go to Izium and take a happy snap, a selfie, with the Ukrainian flag flying over City Hall that used to be with a Russian flag, that's a political victory. When the Ukrainian delegation at the Ramstein contact group, trying to convince the United States and the West and West Europeans to continue to pour billions of dollars in, I'll get to look at them and say, hey, look at all that blue. This is what happens when you give us equipment. We achieved this. Politically, really good. But militarily, they blew their wad. I mean, it's done. They don't have any offensive power left. I mean, they're able to launch a couple attacks here, but nothing real, nothing that can sustain. Even if they manage to break through the Russian defenses, and they're not, I don't believe, they got nothing to back it up. The Russians just pinch it off, pound it with artillery, kill them all. that this was as good as it's going to get for Ukraine. And it's not good enough because Kharkov was the least important front. The Russians have now consolidated on the Oxal River. They've secured the flank of the Lugansk operation. They're going to be able to continue the operation to liberate Donetsk. They've secured Kherson. Kherson has withstood every attack the Ukrainians put forward. So now, is this a Ukrainian victory? And the answer is yes and no. Again, we've talked about political victory, but it's a Pyrrhic victory. And I think overall, this is going to be one of those moments when, are you familiar with John Erickson?
No.
Historian? He's a famous historian, wrote a lot of books, but two of the best known ones are The Road to Stalingrad and The Road to Berlin. It's a 2-book series about the war on the Eastern Front. There's another guy, Glantz is his name. He's written a lot of books about the Eastern Front, really quality historians. Someday the equivalent of Erickson or Glantz is going to write the story of the war in Ukraine. And I will put a dime to a dollar that this battle is going to be seen as one of the turning moments where this was the high water mark of Ukraine. They needed to use these forces better. Politics is a mind game. And the one way that you avoid making stupid decisions based upon politics is being mature and understanding what's going on. And had the Ukrainians used these 30,000 troops as a fire brigade, because what is the goal of NATO? What is the stated goal of NATO in Ukraine? To bleed Russia dry. Okay, NATO doesn't think Ukraine's going to win this war. I mean, Zelensky is, eating some magic mushrooms or something. He thinks he's going to win this conflict. But NATO doesn't think he's going to win. All NATO wants to do is bleed Russia dry. So why does NATO have to be fooled? Here's the irony of it. They have the Ramstein contact group that's getting ready to talk about sending another $600, $700 million arms infusion on top of the tens of billions already been sent in. But they know that they just built a new NATO army for Ukraine. They know that that army is being made available, and they're going, why do you have to prove to yourself that you built an army? It's stupid. What they should have done is held these forces in 3 packets, like 10,000-man packets, and let the Russians do what the Russians have to do. Because in order to win this conflict, Russia has to launch offensive operations to seize territory. Let the Russians launch an attack. One of the greatest, you learn this in first day, not first day, but in the Marine Corps, you're doing your company, you're your company tactics. So you're the company. Okay, we're going to take the hill. And I'm organizing it. I got base of fire, maneuver elements. Okay, we finally assault through. And we assault through the hill, and we take the hill. And you think, oh, you won the battle. But you're actually weaker at that moment than you have been since the fight began. Because by the time you take the hill, your units are dispersed. You have a lot of casualties. You have ammunition. Guys have used ammunition. There's some guys with a lot of ammunition, some guys with no ammunition. There's confusion. The platoon commanders don't know where actually all their squads are. The squad leaders don't know where all the fire teams are. And you, the company commander, don't know squat. Your base of fire is displacing because you're trying to bring them up to the hill, and your maneuver elements are just dispersed all over the place. This is why when you're the defense, the first thing you learn is when they attack, withdraw, let them come in, regroup, and then you immediately counterattack. Because now that OODA loop thing, and the counterattacking force that knows what it wants to do has a tighter OODA loop, and those guys who just took the hill have a sloppy OODA loop, and they're gone. So that's a prize. Russia attacks now. They achieve a breakthrough. And at that moment of the breakthrough, when everybody says, Russia won, you now hit them with a 10,000-man armored fist that says Russia didn't win. And you beat them down, you inflict casualties, you seal the fight, and then you pull back. And you do this over, and Russia's going to push you forward incrementally. But if you do this, what's going to happen? You're going to bleed the Russians white. And that's the last thing the Russians want. They don't want to bleed white. This isn't World War II. This isn't the Great Patriotic War. They're not willing to sacrifice 900,000 men to take a city. If you study the final battles of the Eastern Front, where the German army was defeated already, but they kept fighting. Look at the casualty lists of the Soviets. They're losing 100,000 men, 200,000 men, 60,000 men, 80,000 men. These are in the last days and weeks of the war. The casualty rates were outrageous. Russia doesn't want to get involved in that kind of fight in Ukraine. And what the Ukrainians did by engaging in this stupid counteroffensive, just a dumb counteroffensive for political points only, political points against themselves. Again, I come down to the point, who are they trying to convince? They built the army. They don't have to prove to themselves anything. NATO's going to continue to provide the equipment. It was dumb. And it's going to take them months to rebuild this capability, if they're able to rebuild it at all. Because one thing you can say about the Russians is they make mistakes like everybody else. They learn from their mistakes. There was a Russian commander. I actually had the privilege of interviewing him a couple of weeks ago, Alexander Khodakovsky of the Vostok Battalion from the Donetsk People's Militia. And he said, he wrote, he's very honest. He said, anybody who doesn't think we got, I'm paraphrasing him, but, that we took a black eye, you don't know what you're talking about. They hit us and they hit us hard and it hurt, But he said, this is a new army. This was a NATO army. And we learned a lot. We're not going to make the same mistake again. That's the thing. Russia preserved its most precious resource, its manpower. They learned this lesson, and it's never going to happen to them again. They had one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history. I think it's up there with the 1973 failure of the Israelis when it came to the Yom Kippur War and the failure to anticipate the Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal. This is up there with that. It's a horrible intelligence failure, but the Russians learned. They're going to fix things. They're going to repeat. It doesn't mean they're not going to make mistakes down the road. They're not going to make this mistake again. And I think ultimately this counteroffensive is going to go down in history as in strategic defeat for the Ukrainian forces.
I would agree. I've been calling it a Pyrrhic victory, like you mentioned. You pretty much answered my next question with everything you said, but
I babbled. Sorry about that.
no, it's fine. It's what we want to. But it seems like the Russians slowed down not just with their ground forces in the past month or so, but also with airstrikes and things. For a long time, we were seeing caliber missile strikes almost every single day on Telegram channels and whatnot, and that just seemed to stop for a week, maybe two. And there's reports that they weren't hitting Ukrainian supply lines, and by not hitting those supply lines, it allowed the Ukrainians to prepare for these counteroffensives. Why is that? Why were they not hitting the supply lines? Why did the Air Force and the caliber missiles slow down?
Well, I think we saw something interesting in the battle. The Russians, they still have caliber missiles. We saw that they fired a whole bunch of them to take out the electrical grid. And let me bring up that electrical grid before I answer this question. Let's talk about it for a second because it's part of the air campaign. When this war started, a lot of people, including myself, thought the Russians were going to come in doctrinally and that they would lead off with what, the equivalent of the Desert Storm strategic air campaign to totally wipe out Ukrainian infrastructure, et cetera, weaken lines of communication. They didn't do that because it's a special military operation that's designed to reduce damage to Ukrainian civilian infrastructure and try to avoid unnecessary casualties amongst the Ukrainian civilians and even amongst the Ukrainian military. The goal wasn't to wage a war of annihilation. It was to get the Ukrainian military convinced to give up. So they came in soft. It's like I said, not just switching your stance from left foot forward to right foot forward, but, tying one of your hands behind your back kind of thing. And that's been a hallmark of this conflict. It's frustrating for people who study military art, military history, and know what the potential of Russia is to see unrecognized, unfulfilled potential on the battlefield. But that's a political decision made by the Russian leadership. I believe that Russia began planning for this conflict, at least the potential of this conflict, as far back as 2007. I think they've been building up ammunition stocks that are, that are sufficient. But I don't believe Russia ever planned for this war to last 6 months. I don't think they did. That doesn't mean that their military people didn't say, we're going to, if we're planning a 6-month conflict, let's get 18 months worth of supplies. You always get more than what you need. But, the Caliber missile is a relatively new missile. It only recently had its virginity taken away from it in a combat sense in Syria, where the Russians began firing some Caliber missiles from their Caspian flotilla and from some aircraft. Um, and there's not an infinite supply of calibers. I mean, they're technologically advanced missiles. I think the Russians have all cylinders going, but there's X amount of calibers available, and the Russians have to hold some of these calibers back just in case there's a conflict with NATO. You don't want to shoot all your weapons there. And I think what we saw, one of the reasons why Russia hit a pause, is that they need to recalibrate how they're going to go forward. A weapon that wasn't used on the battlefield was a bomb called Fab 500. I think it's a 1,000 kilogram bomb, or 500 kilograms, maybe 1,000 pound bomb. Maybe that's why it's called a Fab 500. Yeah, Marine math, baby. But they started using these bombs. They're very powerful bombs. They're air delivered bombs, but they didn't use them early on in the conflict. Now they're using them. So as you see the calibers drop, you see the Fab come up. And I think what you're seeing is the Russians saying we have to preserve our precision strike capability. We're bringing in the Fab to do damage, but I think we're reflecting that the Russians, while they're not running out of ammunition, it's becoming a logistical problem that needs to be resolved. This is one of the reasons why Medvedev visited the city of Tula, one of the major arms production facilities in Russia. He visited them last week, I believe, and he said, "You guys, we got to be working overtime now. We got to keep crunching this stuff out." I think all of Russia's defense industry right now is punching weapons out. One of the reasons why you do an operational pause is to allow some of this inventory to build back up. But they still have calibers. We saw that when they struck the electrical power grid. Now, the thing about the electrical power grid is people, when it happened, everybody, the Russians took their gloves off. I went, no, they didn't. Not at all. What the Russians did is, remember that withdrawal we talked about and the consolidation of troops? And remember how I talked about when you're fluid, when there's fluidity on the battlefield, uncertainty is created because I don't want to get too technical in the military, but if I'm going to defend, I have to lock myself in with the units on my left, the units on my right, and the units behind me. I have to coordinate everything for it to work as designed. But if I'm just running up now and digging into my foxhole, I haven't locked in anything yet. I need time. And the Ukrainians had the initiative. And there was a risk that as Russia tried to consolidate this defensive line, that the Ukrainians would come upon them and overwhelm the Russian defenses. So Russia needed to break up the Ukrainian attack. And what they did is they shut down the electrical grid for all of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. Any area that had any meaningful relationship with the battlefield got the power turned off. And in doing so, you froze the battlefield. Ukraine was no longer able to move at will. The electric trains weren't working, etc. The proof, though, that it wasn't taking the gloves off is, and I've done this during Desert Storm, as one of the guys that was involved in the targeting of Iraq's, strategic infrastructure. When we take out a power plant, we take out a power plant. It's never going to be brought back up. You got to rebuild a whole new power plant. That's how we take out a power plant. It's not what Russia did. Russia hit the power plant, shut it off, but literally 24 hours later, the power's back on. Why? Well, the Ukrainians reestablished connectivity, rebuilt certain infrastructure, etc. Russia deliberately made sure that this wasn't permanent damage. Why? Special military operation, reduce casualties to civilians, reduce damage to civilian infrastructure. So they knocked out the power to freeze the battlefield, to buy the defense time to lock in. They hit a dam. They blew up a dam. They ended up flooding a river, flooding a city. Rogue is a strategic city. It's Zelensky's birthplace. A little bit of political symbolism here, but it's also where the regional command and control was. Well, you can't have too much command and control and logistics fluidity if you're fluidity, bad word, because the entire city's flooded. It's very fluid right now, but nothing's moving. And then over the river, the Ukrainians, together with a lot of NATO assistance, built a whole bunch of bridges across the river. And so you could supply the units that are on the other side of the river so they could prepare to attack the Russians. And the Russians wanted to nullify this attack. You hit the dam, you flood the river, the rising water wipes out all the bridges. Literally, all the bridges are wiped out. The troops that are here now have no resupply. And in combat, when you don't have resupply, it's like having a race car and you're racing. But try and run the Indy 500 without a pit stop. What happens to your car?
It'll break down.
Yes, and it just stalls. So that's what happens here. They have guys in fight, but their gas ran out, their ammunition ran out, their food ran out, nothing. They got no resupply, but they don't pause. It's not like you're in combat and you suddenly say, stop. The troops still got to eat. They still got to shoot. The vehicle still got to run. So the engine's still consuming stuff, but you can't resupply it. And they run on empty now. And now they're desperate. These guys are trapped there, and the Russians are just pounding the living dog food out with air power and artillery, and they destroyed it. Those two things were critical for stabilizing the front. And again, when the history's written, these two actions are going to be up there. People are going to study it for years about that. But the Russians still have the ability to strike deep. They're using a different mix of weapons. I think you're seeing strategic bombers coming in and using some old Soviet-era cruise missiles now as a way to supplement the caliber. They burned through their calibers. They burned up a lot of calibers. It's not an infinite supply. This is an age of empire where you sit there and get to put in a cheat in the program and just the button and build up all your gold. It doesn't work that way. It's reality. You actually got to build the stuff. It takes time. The Russians are building it. They are delivering it. And the other thing we're finding out too with the Russians is as this war goes on, they're starting to introduce the good stuff. The good weapons. we saw that a little while ago where suddenly we're seeing videotapes of these precision guided munitions using TV. We get the TV screen and it's coming in and boop, boop, there's the window. There's the surprised face in the window and then it's dead. I don't know about the face. I'm making that part up. But the window thing, they're introducing a new generation of weaponry. So they're starting to bring this weaponry in and use it. So the Russians, I think everything's under control, but there's a reason for an operational pause, and you don't have an infinite number of calibers. You don't have an infinite number of the Onyx missiles, the coastal defense missiles that are being used to strike deep. You don't have an infinite number of Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Everybody's like, why don't they Kinzhal this, Kinzhal that? I'm pronouncing that wrong. The Russians are rolling in the grave right now, but because you don't have an infinite quantity of it. You're building it up. But remember, Russia has other obligations. Do you really think that the Far East Command, which is preparing for a potential conflict with Japan and the United States over the Kuril Islands, wants to give up all of its precision strike munitions? No. They have a duty and responsibility to meet the mission given to them, and they need a certain amount of military hardware to do it. So you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. And that holds for everywhere else. The periphery is exploding right now. We see Azerbaijan and Armenia fighting. We see fighting between the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks right now. And every one of those has a Russian military resource attached to it in terms of problem solving. And that problem solving has a campaign plan, which is attached to a logistical sustainability plan, which is attached to the availability of ammunition, fuel, etc., all of which cannot be diverted to Ukraine, or else you can't accomplish your mission. So Russia has a lot of stuff, but a lot of that stuff is allocated already. And so for Ukraine, which was a unplanned, before Ukraine exists, you had military districts. Now Ukraine has created its own military reality, a new military reality that's absorbing stuff, just like when we invaded Afghanistan. Once Afghanistan becomes a reality, we have to start pumping in equipment that wasn't designed for anybody else, just for Afghanistan. The Russians right now, 6 months into this conflict, have to start redevising their long-term logistical sustainability plan that incorporates the new Ukrainian reality. So they have to increase production everywhere and bring it in. And that's what they're doing. That's what this pause is supposed to do. I believe they're going to take full advantage of the wintertime to continue this buildup so that come spring, I think we're going to see the caliber waking up, saying, I'm ready to go in again, boss. Send me in.
So There's much talk of, we've seen that they hit the power grid, like you said, they're starting to hit critical infrastructure. I've even heard that, the Russians have been kind of hesitant to hit retreating Ukrainian units, and they're starting to do that. Do you think that Russia is going to reclassify the Ukrainian military to a terrorist organization, pretty much, so that they can change their rules of engagement?
The problem with that particular weapon is it's a double-edged sword. Uh, Once because Ukraine's been screaming at the top of their lungs, call the Russians terrorists, call the Russians terrorists, designate them as terrorists. And Blinken and Sullivan and Biden have all been very smart. One of the few times they've been smart in this whole thing. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. Because here's the deal. If you call the Russians terrorists, they're just not going to talk to you ever again. They'll shut down the embassy. They'll cease all connectivity. And that's the precursor for general war with Russia. And the United States does not want to and has no intention of engaging in a general conflict with Russia over Ukraine. This isn't going to happen. This is not an existential struggle for the United States. It's not even, NATO is making it an existential struggle by committing so much. If I go on vacation to Las Vegas and I saved up, $1,000 and I'm going to go to Las Vegas and I'm going to gamble for 2 nights and all that. If I budgeted that $1,000 and I lose it, that's not an existential struggle for the Ritter household. But if I go to Vegas and I blow the $1,000 on the first night and I max out my credit cards and then I take my mortgage and I take everything and put it all on red, suddenly Vegas became an existential issue for the Ritter household. That's what's happening with NATO right now. They are overcommitting resources to a proposition that they can't win. They will not win in Ukraine. The notion of bleeding Russia dry is foolhardy. It's not going to work. But even if it does work, do you really want that to happen? Because that raises the stakes. Now it becomes an existential struggle for Russia. You want to take the term existential out of this problem for everybody but Ukraine. This is an existential issue for Ukraine, a life or death issue. But Ukraine does not define European security. It does not define global relations. It's not the center of the universe. Ukraine's just another corrupt nation run by neo-Nazis that probably history should resolve. But NATO's turning this into existential. They're overcommitting resources to a losing proposition, and they don't have the ability to back it up. This is problematic, and the United States is eventually going to have to manage that problem. Everybody says the United States had, I saw General Hodges speak the other day, and he said, we're going to have to learn to manage a Russian defeat. What are the consequences of a Russian defeat? Hey, dude, you can make all the PowerPoints you want. Russia ain't losing. But other people are talking about managing a Russian victory. If Russia wins, how do we manage the Russian victory? The United States should start focusing on how do you manage the collapse of NATO, not driven by Russia, but by NATO. When I talk about that, let's look at what's happening right now. Some very interesting things are happening, by the way, on that front. Turkey is talking about going to war against Greece. They're both NATO countries. Now, Turkey's been talking about going to war against Greece forever. Turkey actually won a war against Greece back in the 1970s when they invaded Cyprus. It wasn't a full war, but it was by proxy. Tensions are high. But France has come in and said if Turkey fights Greece, France is coming in on the side of Greece, and now we got us a nice little NATO fight. That's okay because the Germans and the Poles are getting ready to do them one better. The Poles have come out and said, we want Germany to pay us reparations for World War II. And now Scholz has come out and said, if you really want to start digging around in the history books, pal, maybe we're going to think about that border. Think of the fact that you guys are sitting on German territory right now. We still call it Silesia for a reason. All those names, Stettin, that you renamed, it is a German city. You want to play history games? We'll play history games. So Poland and Germany right now are actually making some of the most bellicose statements imaginable. NATO is not a healthy organization at all. There's a real risk of it collapsing. And that risk becomes even more manifest the more NATO overcommits to Ukraine. The United States needs to step in at some point in time and manage this problem. Literally, We need to hit pause for the cause on Ukraine. It's a lost cause. Stop putting the mortgage on it. Don't put the kids' college fund on it. Don't put anything on it. We're done betting on Ukraine. We have to turn to the Poles and the Germans and say, time out. Each one of you to the corners of your room, shut up. Turkey and Greece, stop it. Calm down. Everybody calm down. Let's bring order. But instead, we've instituted economic sanctions against Russian energy that have backfired and are destroying the economic fabric of Europe as we speak. And it's not even cold right now. It's cooling down, but wait till it gets cold. Europe is going to fracture. NATO is going to fracture. The European Union may disappear. There may be revolutions in the street in Europe. Germany may become a revolutionary society because it is the one that has the greatest risk of massive collapse. When you have the German government talking about, coming up with plans to put the army in the streets, you got a problem. Because now you're asking the army to pull the trigger on starving, hungry, desperate people. History shows us what happens when you ask a military to do that. Remember when the Tsarist regime asked the Tsarist army to fire on the people in the streets? Army switched sides.
Yeah.
Didn't go well for the Tsar. It's not going to go well for Scholz. It's not going to go well for the German foreign minister who said that she doesn't care about the German people and the will of the German people, that she's going to support Ukraine no matter what. This is the kind of suicidal singularity that's going to cause Europe to collapse. In the United States, we need to be managing that. And I say this not from the standpoint of, I think that, American policy is good. This is the proper role of the United States right now. We the Pottery Barn rule, if you break it, you own it. We broke Europe, baby. We broke it. Now we need to come in and see if there's a way that we can glue as many of these pieces back together so that the pot holds water come spring. This is bad time. And the United States is doing the exact wrong thing all the time. The OODA loop applies to diplomacy as well and geopolitical decision-making. Joe Biden is so far back on the OODA loop that he's not going to catch up with all the different revolutionary movements, energy security movements, everything that's going on. They live in a fantasy world. How do we solve the energy problem that we created by sanctioning Russian energy? We're going to sanction them again, and we're going to put a price cap on them. Well, that's not going to work. There's not an energy professional in the world that will tell you that's going to work. It's going to fail and make the matters worse. This is bad times, bad times. Old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Man, it's about as interesting as it gets right now.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We're already seeing those demonstrations in the streets of Europe, like you're talking about. Czech Republic, Germany, France, everywhere. It seems
it's not even cold yet.
Yeah, it's
not even cold.
Only the beginning. People are still full. They're not hungry.
If you believe in God, and I don't care if your God is a tree god, a nature god, the God, a God, he God, she God, whatever you want to call it, start praying, baby, for a warm winter. And I mean that for everybody. I know there's some pro-Russian people out there saying, I want the coldest winter possible. No, you don't. Russia's going to emerge from this looking pretty good no matter what. But it's not in Russia's best interest to have Europe collapse. And it's not in humanity's best interest to have Europe collapse. Europe has an important role to play in the world today. We need a stable Europe. I'm not a fan of European political elite, but I'm not a fan of unqualified revolutionary change either. It's better to dance with the devil you know than the demon you don't. We need the warmest winter possible for the least harm possible on Europe, so that they can manage their way through this problem. If it's a cold winter, there's dark times for the world.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on. It seems like the West is trying to force Russia into going into general mobilization. You see what's going on with first we had Kosovo and Serbia a couple weeks ago, and now Georgia is talking about holding a referendum on declaring war on Russia, and Armenia and Azerbaijan are flaring up again. It seems so obvious to anyone who's informed that this is the West trying to force Russia to somewhat overextend itself or go into general mobilization. Would you agree?
Well, I look, let's answer this two ways. I know for a fact, I can't say no for a fact. I strongly believe that in Langley, Virginia, there's a organization whose job it is to screw up the entire world. That's their job. They do political direct action. They do information warfare because the CIA is there as a disruptive force to disrupt the world to benefit the United States. That's a large part of what their covert action is. We buy off politicians. We steal elections. That's what we do. And they are sitting there, and they, you know, there's a CIA station just about everywhere in the world that deals with every part of the world, and they have plans to create chaos and anarchy where it benefits the United States. But chaos and anarchy isn't invented in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is, let's take Azerbaijan and Armenia. The CIA can push an issue in the direction that the issue wants to go, but it's very difficult for the CIA to get it to go 100. Azerbaijan and Iran have been fighting this way since, in modern terms, since 1988. Not Iran, I'm sorry, Armenia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, since 88. This is the third rodeo for them. The last one didn't go too well. The first one didn't go well for Azerbaijan. The last one didn't go too well for Armenia. They both have resentment, etc. So I don't believe that the CIA sat there and went, "Oh, look, Azerbaijan and Armenia are living in peace and harmony. Let's go in and create, turmoil and violence." I think the CIA went, "Hey, these two guys hate each other. We got this peace plan that's not working. Go in and buy off some Armenian opposition politicians. I want a lot of pressure on the government. Let's go to Azerbaijan and talk about opening up some fuel lines to Europe if they'll only ratchet up the president. Let's put all the pressure on everybody to get everybody to do what we need to create conflict." And I think that's probably what happened. The same thing with what's going on in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. I think there's CIA presidents. The CIA is everywhere. But these were, Kyrgyz and the Tajiks, they have a history. That the area that they're fine, they've done it before. There's been tension there for some time now. Kosovo, the CIA didn't invent that problem today. They invented that problem back in 1998, 1997, 1998, KLA. So there's that. Yes, the CIA and the British are also involved, and other foreign intelligence services are involved in a strategic plan designed to put as much pressure on Russia as possible. And that's the goal. It's hard to say that they're going to say we want general mobilization. I think the goal is to create as much instability as possible, to stress Russia as possible, to dissipate Russian attention, et cetera. But here's the problem. Russia has one of the best foreign ministries in the world. This is a foreign ministry staffed with people who are very well educated about the areas of the world that they deal with. The CIA thinks they're clever, but the Russians know the problem of Azerbaijan and Armenia better than the CIA does. They have an entire team of people that works on this. Both of those republics used to be part of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of connectivity still between Russia and Azerbaijan, Russia and Armenia. The CIA, this is like me going to a volcano with a couple of firecrackers and watching the volcano erupt and throwing firecrackers into the stream of lava going, "Look, I'm making it go, mama. I'm making it go. I'm not doing anything except making things go pop." The lava is going to go where the lava is going to go. And Russia controls that volcano. We don't. So I think Russia is far more mature, far more capable than people give them credit for. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. None of it's taking Russia by surprise. And if you look at each one of them, who's the leader in trying to come up with a diplomatic resolution? The Russian Foreign Ministry. And they're calm. There's no panic. They don't overreact. Armenia, we need the CSTO to come in and defend us. And the Russians went, "Nah, we're not going to do that. Not because we don't believe in the viability of the CSTO, not because it's not the right thing to do. It's destabilizing. And we're going to send an observer mission. We're going to invite in other diplomatic parties because the Russians actually maintain connectivity with the entire world, unlike the Americans who tend to cut off everything. So no, they're not. And then now we come back to the terrorism The United States labels Russia a terrorist organization, and all 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 connectivity is going to be turned off. Russia's not going to deal with that. That's why I don't believe it's going to happen. This is why I don't believe Russia is going to redesignate it as a terrorism operation. I think what the Russians will do is expand the scope and scale of the special military operation, and we see what they're doing right now. Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, pretty interesting. That when this Kharkov offensive first started, he was out there saying, you know, Russia, don't panic. I know the answer. You need general mobilization. We need to win this thing decisively. And then he got the special invitation into the special briefing. And it's not the briefing that says, if you don't shut up, we kill you. No, that's not how Russia works. It's a briefing that said, let me show you the bigger picture here. The primary front in this war is not being fought in Ukraine. It's being fought globally, and it's an economic war. And the key aspect of this is the continued functioning of the Russian economy. The Russian economy is in a difficult transition period from primary linkage with the West now to primary linkage with the East. We need to remember when we talked about how the Russians went back to the Oxal line, how they had to jump in and do all that connectivity and stuff. That's what the Russian economy is trying to do right now. Get all of its connectivity in place, get everything settled down. General mobilization would disrupt all of this. So you don't want general mobilization. General mobilization is literally the last resort. If somebody invades, if Russia's about to fall, things like that. There's no emergency right now in Ukraine. It's very stable. The Russians have it under control. It got ugly there, but Russia has it under control. And then Kadyrov came out and said, okay, instead of general mobilization, what we need is a reinvigoration of national volunteerism. And he believed that the Chechens could take the lead in training up to 85,000 volunteers. In effect, a special class of contract soldiers. And the way the Russian Constitution, the way Russia works, is the federation is broken down into different republics and different districts, and then there's a head dude, and he has certain powers to do things within his district, and the law is such that he can raise volunteer units to support Ukraine. So I think what the Russians are going to do is to try and tap into the extreme patriotism that's risen up because of this conflict, not because the Russians supported the SMO to begin with. A lot of them did, but a lot of them didn't. But because I think Russia realizes now that NATO is at war with Russia and that Russia cannot lose this war. Russia must win this war. And therefore, people need to step up to the plate and support Russia. And I think you're going to see them be able to generate 150, 200,000 volunteers. And you won't need general mobilization, and you won't need to redesignate it as a terrorist or a terrorist operation or anything like that. You can keep this SMO designation. You're just going to increase the number of resources available.
Would that be in addition to the 200,000 already deployed?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you're going to need between 300 and 400,000 troops to accomplish not only the liberation of when I say liberation, that has a Russian bias to it. Mm-hmm. So the Ukrainians will say the occupation to establish control over the Donbass and to denazify and demilitarize. I mean, demilitarization, has been defined by the Russians as getting rid of all NATO influence. Well, we now know that the Ukrainian military is a NATO military, so it means you have to get rid of the entire NATO, the entire Ukrainian military. This can only be accomplished with either unconditional surrender on the part of Ukraine or the strategic and total defeat of the Ukrainian army. Either one of those requires more than 200,000 troops to accomplish. Denazification is about the top to bottom political restructuring of Ukraine, which means the Zelensky government has to be removed, another government has to be brought in, the parliament has to be replaced, the constitution has to be rewritten, Western Ukraine has to be dealt with, Bandera has to be eradicated. This isn't going to be done with 200,000 troops. So, the Russians, if they insist on maintaining 200,000 troops within this current framework, are going to end up in a stalemate. That stalemate's going to lead to a long-term war of attrition that is going to result in Russia losing because Russia didn't win. Every time Israel fights Hezbollah, The Israeli army's never really defeated. I mean, they don't surrender and all that. They kill a lot of Hezbollah guys, but in the end of the day, they end up having to withdraw back to their lines. And Hezbollah therefore wins by default. They win by not losing. If the Russians can't accomplish their stated objectives of the special military operation, then Russia loses by not winning, and Ukraine wins by not losing. And that's the direction we're headed right now, unless Russia allocates sufficient resources. And I think Kadyrov and the others have come up with a solution that's viable. The recruitment of these volunteer units, which are going to be raised specifically to fight in the special military operation. And I think if they can get 100, 150, 200,000 of these, Russia's going to end up doing okay in this conflict.
Yeah. It looks like we're having some problems with the stream. It keeps failing, and I'm restarting it, but people are coming back. They're saying they got a CIA team on us, shutting us down. So we're up against a big force. I wanted to go to there a couple weeks ago. There was an Israeli mercenary who was captured by Russian forces, and they sent him back to Israel, and that is different than the treatment that a lot of mercenaries are getting. A lot of the mercenaries from Britain and Western countries have been sentenced to death in some cases. Why do you think they allowed the Israeli one to go home?
I have to be really careful I answer this question, not because I'm afraid of the truth. It's just that this is such a hot potato. Anytime you talk about Israel and the Jewish relationships, you got to be really careful what you say because your words can be misconstrued. So I want to start off by saying that I am not the most diplomatically adept person with my language, and I don't intend to insult anybody. But the Russian Jewish problem or the Soviet Jewish problem has been a problem. I mean, go back to the 1970s and the issue of Jewish migration to get out of. Go back to World War II and the Holocaust. Go back to Tsarist Russia and the pogroms. I mean, the Jews have been on the short end of the stick historically for a long time. The state of Israel was created with the hope of providing the Jewish people, mainly European Jews, with a homeland where they could live with never again in fear of pogroms, holocausts, etc. There's still a significant Jewish population that lives in Europe today, in Russia, Ukraine, elsewhere. During Soviet times, this became a sort of a political, hot potato. How do you get the Jews that wanted to immigrate to Israel, immigrate to the United States? How do you convince the Soviets to allow this to happen? We passed a law. Two guys, Action, and then there's another name. But it was basically a law that sanctioned Russia because of their restrictive immigration policies for Jews. When the Soviet Union collapsed, especially in Ukraine, there was a massive immigration of Jews from Ukraine, from Russia to Israel. I was in Israel at the time. I worked in Israel from 1994 to 1998, off and on. I did a lot of trips there. And the Israelis, they were very open about it. They said this has fundamentally changed the reality of Israel. Israel went from being a nation of around 5 million to a nation of over 6 million. And that increase was all Soviet Jews coming in, who had a completely different outlook on Arab-Israeli relations. It said they became a very powerful political force. And that political force exists today. There's strong ties between the diaspora. It's not a diaspora really because they're living in their homeland now, but the Jews that live in Israel that were from the Soviet Union have strong connectivity with Russia and Ukraine. The political ties are there. There's great sensitivity right now with Russia's involvement in Syria, where Russia and Israel have the potential of direct conflict, and both sides are working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. So this is a political hot potato for the Russians. We know that there's a lot of Jewish mercenaries, Israeli mercenaries in Ukraine. But we also know that the Jewish issue has far more radioactivity attached to it than just about any other. And look, I know this personally because, I was accused for political reasons back when I was a UN weapons inspector. I was accused of being an Israeli spy. I was charged with espionage, the penalty of which is death.
Wow.
So, the I personally know how much of a hot potato the issue of Israel is for American politics. The charges were all eventually dropped, by the way, because I wasn't an Israeli spy. But the point is, there's a lot of sensitivities about Israel, and I think those sensitivities they are bigger in Russia than people possibly know. The sensitivity of the Russian government about the Jewish question, Jewish issues. So, yeah, Russia's not going to allow an Israeli, a Jew, to be killed by a Russian. Just think about it for a second. With all the history that happened, you're going to take a Jew, you're going to condemn him to death, and you're going to execute him.
Well,
really, that's the image you want to project. So no, you're just going to send that guy home and pretend it never happened.
Well, they wouldn't be killing him because he's Jewish. It would be because
it doesn't matter. The spin, man, the spin. It's just optically, you don't want to create that. This is in Ukraine. Bobby Yar, 30, 40,000 guys got slaughtered. I'm just saying, again, I have to be really careful what I'm saying right now. This is a very, very sensitive topic, but from pure optics, regardless of what you think. Remember, I think I've told you this before. I've said it many, many times. Brigadier General Roland LaJoy, commander or the director of the On-Site Inspection Agency, I'm locked in front of his desk because I did something I thought was right. And he's convinced that I did it was wrong. So I'm explaining to him why I'm right. And he shut me up. And he said, Ritter, when you're explaining, you're losing. And right now you're in front of my desk explaining. You lost. Get out of here. No Russian politician, no foreign ministry wants to sit there and because say, hey, look, we're legally correct. As a mercenary, he committed crimes and all that. So we have every right to try him and execute him like everybody else. Wow. So we have one great moment where we get to execute the guy, and then we have to spend 15 years dealing with the political fallout of that. Strategically, just make him disappear, send him home. And I think that's what they're doing.
So are you saying that Russian leadership is worried about the blowback they would get domestically or internationally? Because
both.
Why would Russia care internationally at this point? I mean, internationally speaking, the West, they don't care.
Because of the strong, remember, 1/6 fully, well, more than that, maybe a quarter of the Israeli population has strong links, familial links with Russia. It's a big problem. You can't ignore it. So yeah, it's a political problem for Russia. It's not that they care what the United States thinks or anybody else, but remember, Russia also has to interface with the world. You don't want to be the Russian foreign ministry showing up in any nation having demonstrations saying Jew killer. No, that's a problem we don't need. So rather than doing something that's right and then trying to explain it to a world that doesn't want to hear the explanation, they've already made their decision on how they're going to spin this. Just make the problem go away. Send him home. Don't talk about it.
That makes sense.
And now I'm going to get a million. I don't know what your chat's looking like, but I just know that I'm going to get attacked for this. So, yay!
You're going to get attacked anyways, right? Yeah. I wanted to talk about Russia seems to be implementing Iranian drones on the battlefield, specifically.
Yeah, that surprised me.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, let me tell you why it surprised me. Not that Russia wouldn't absorb technology that's needed. First of all, there's a lot we don't know. The drone looks like, sounds like, smells like. It looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck. It's a duck. These drones look like a Shahed 139, quack like a 139, talk like. I think they're probably Shahed 139s. The Russian can call them, I think there's another name. It begins with a G, a GNOME 2 or something like that. Is this an Iranian drone that's just simply been repainted? Or is this an Iranian drone design that's been taken to a Russian factory and built to Russian standards? I always felt that the Russians would hesitate to absorb large numbers of Iranian-built drones simply because of no military likes to buy something sight unseen. What is the quality control? What is the maintenance? There's a whole bunch of issues attached to bringing in this weapon system that can create problems for the Russians if they haven't planned this sufficiently. So I thought the notion of them, the United States is trying to spin this as Russia went to Iran and desperately bought thousands of drones that we're going to bring in and start using. And I said, that doesn't really sound like what Russia would be doing. Well, let's start off with reality. Apparently, Russia's using a lot of drones that look an awful lot like the Shahed-130. They're using them very effectively. I mean, they're swarming the area. So did Russia do what I didn't think they were going to do and go out and buy all these drones already built by the Iranians and simply repaint them? Or did Russia set up an assembly line in Russia, bring in prototypes, reverse engineer them, and are cranking them out now? And one of the ways you do this is the Iranians can send in what we'll call kits. And we see this anytime, like when Egypt builds the M1A1 or the M1 tank, we send kits into Egypt, and then Egypt assembles those kits into the tank. So they're Egyptian built, but they're American kits. Did Iran send in kits to a Russian factory that then assembles them, putting in Russian components where they need? Because, what encryption are they using? Are they using Iranian encryption? That's incompatible with Russian encryption. What communication systems are they using? When something breaks, do they have to go back to Iran to get the spare parts, or are they going to put in a Russian system that already has its own spare parts availability for maintenance? So these are questions we don't know. What it appears, though, is that Russia made a decision that the Shahed-139 type drone was of value in Ukraine. And when I said I thought that the Kalashnikov factory was going to produce enough of these Russian suicide drones that Russia didn't need to worry about that. It appears I was wrong, that maybe Russia had exhausted the stockpile that came out of Kalashnikov, and that the new reality of war in Ukraine requires these drones, and that they weren't going to be able to build enough, so they went out and bought drones. That appears to be the case. So, hey, that's what happens when you do intelligence analysis. You make a decision up front, the facts change, you have to reassess. It looks like Russia is. Now, I personally believe this is more a case of Russia assembling kits and installing Russian components that provide for connectivity with communication-wise, secure comms, and for maintenance with parts. I don't know. I mean, the only way I'd know is if I actually got my hands on one of the, some of the wreckage and went through it and got the serial numbers off and traced the serial numbers back, etc. But it doesn't matter. Russia's using them, so that's the new reality.
Well, aren't they suicide drones, kamikaze drones, if you
Yeah,
will? So
yeah.
what maintenance would really be necessary on them?
Over time, I mean, things have to, even when you're not using stuff, you've got to maintain it, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, I think, more critically, good question. Good question. You could be a UN weapons inspector. That's the kind of question you ask to follow up when some guy's streaming a line of BS. Hit him with the question. But the other thing is the communications. You still have to communicate. And one thing we don't know are these AI drones, artificial intelligence. Are these launch and forget? Meaning that I've got my drone, I program a search area, I put in what I'm looking for, and then I fire it off. And if that's the case, then maybe you don't need to worry about communications. I don't know enough about the how this drone actually works to come up with that answer. I do know that the Russians are loath to acquire systems outside of the defense industry weapons procurement cycle, but wars bring on their own their own realities, and regardless of what I thought, what I think, etc., those drones are there and they're being used. Whether Russia has sufficient maintenance, whether they have sufficient communications, it don't matter. They're using them, and that it is what it is.
How do you think these drones will affect the battlefield? What battlefield effect will they have?
Well, again, I don't know enough about the drones. Meaning,
Right.
what is the response? Are they be jammed? Um, or how easily can they be shot down? Because for every problem, there's a solution. There's no such thing as the perfect weapon. Right now, about the only perfect weapon that's been employed in Ukraine theater is the Kinzhal missile. There's no solution to that. You fire it, it's going to hit what it's going to hit. Um, Other than that, there's a solution for everything. So, one of the dangers, for instance, let's say the United States was right and Russia bought, I don't know, thousands of these drones. Now they bring them in and they start using them. And immediately the Ukrainians, because remember, the Ukrainians have, the wreckage that's on the ground? You know who controls it right now? Us,
Oh,
America.
okay.
The Ukrainians got the wreckage. They've pulled the wreckage out, and you have technical intelligence teams right now that are going through that thing, doing everything I just told you about. They're trying to reverse engineer this, find out what the hell's going on. They're testing the paint, materials. They're going through and checking the glue that's used. They're doing everything to figure out where this came from, what it does, what its vulnerabilities are, etc. And once they figure that out, they will come up with a solution. They'll figure out what the radar cross section of this thing is. They'll program the air defense radars to specifically track this thing down. They'll figure out what its heat signature is. They'll program the heat-seeking warheads. There is a solution. So if the Russians bought 1,000 of these things, they use 75, and the Ukrainians get a solution. The rest of it, the 925 that are left, are very valuable. So we have to answer that question. But let's say it works perfectly. The one thing it does is it allows the Russians to more effectively answer, for instance, the HIMARS problem. Because right now, HIMARS, it's a big shell game. They're moving HIMARS around, boom, 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 bring it up, fire, 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 back, 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 resupply, resupply. And the Russians right now are doing their thing, intelligence-wise, and every once in a while they get lucky. Hey, there it is in the warehouse. Bam, we got us a HIMARS. Oh, look, the HIMARS is out in the open. Bam, we got us a HIMARS. But they're not getting all of them because the HIMARS is continuing to pound the dog poop out of the Russians. So what these drones do, in theory, I believe you can fire them out, and they're going to be patrolling over this area, and they're programmed to look for HIMARS-type footprints, identify it, and then on their own, come in and attack it. And they can do that with air defense. They're programmed to check out a specific kind of target. And if they work, you now have a greater disruptive capability than before. They can go deep, they can disrupt, they can improve Russia's ability to interdict supply lines, shut down NATO command and control. They can shut down radars, counter battery radars. So if they work, they're a very important weapon. They can be decisive. But again, every weapon has a solution, and I don't know. I don't know enough to tell you whether or not Ukraine is going to be able to come up with a solution quickly. Russia has shown a proclivity to be able to nullify a lot of the technology that we bring in. We give Ukraine a new kind of technology. The Ukrainians use it to great effect. They kill a bunch of Russians, but the Russians sit there and look at. They got their technical intelligence guys too. They sit there, boom, 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 change, 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 change. Bam, nothing. HARM missile. The HARM missile. It was our secret weapon, not secret, but it was the Iraqis knew you couldn't turn on an air defense weapon radar, and because you're going to get about 20 harms fired at you, and boom, that's into the radar. It was a very good weapon, and in theory, it could cause a lot of problems for Russian air defense. But it appears the Russians have figured this thing out. The harm isn't having the impact on the battlefield that they thought it was going to have, because for every weapon, there's a solution, and the Russians apparently have a solution for that. And the Russians are working on a solution for HIMARS as well. So, Ukraine and NATO are going to be working on a solution to the Sheen 139. That's just the way war works.
We're seeing another weapons package going to Ukraine. I believe the Biden administration announced it either yesterday or earlier this morning, and they say it will include quote advanced missile systems. And the Russians warned that if the USA does provide longer range missiles, then Russia would consider them what do you call it?
Threat.
Yes, a
Or,
direct threat.
well, basically the United States becomes a party to the conflict, a
Yes,
direct party to the conflict.
yes, Russia is saying they would consider the U.S. a direct party to the conflict. Um, I have two questions here. One, what missile do you think it is? Do you think it's possibly the MGM 140, which is fired by HIMARS and has a longer range? And then also, what would Russia's response be if the U.S. did indeed provide them?
Well, the easiest part of that question to answer, I think, is it's the ATACMS, and I don't know if that's the MGM 240 that you just used, but it's the 300-kilometer range missile. On the HIMARS, you can fire the HIMARS either in the 12 missile pod, or you can remove that pod and you can put in the single missile ATACMS. Only on the tracked variant. I don't think the wheeled variant can fire the ATACMS. The ATACMS is a 300-kilometer range missile, battlefield support missile. Great lethality, great accuracy, and it would give the Ukrainians the ability to take out, for instance, if the Ukraine had the ATACMS, the Kherson Bridge is history.
Even with the S-400s?
Even with the S-400. One of them will eventually get through and say goodbye to that bridge. Mm-hmm. So, and Russia, that's an existential issue for Russia. They're not going to respond well there. It also threatens the strategic depth of Russia. And so if that happens, Russia basically can't allow it to happen. Now, I don't think that means that Russia is going to be firing off this, Sarmat missile towards Washington, D.C. But I do believe it means that Ramstein Air Base becomes fair game. I believe it means a lot of U.S. Infrastructure and NATO infrastructure, anything in Europe that touches the ATACMS, from the aircraft that brings it in, to the airfield that receives it, to the warehouses that store it, to the trucks and things that bring it in, all that becomes fair game. And Russia will attack. And this is not unprecedented. Look, the United States just threatened China with the same thing. They said, if you attack Taiwan, your entire logistics infrastructure on the Chinese mainland becomes fair game. We're going to attack that. And Russia's just, basically holding up the same standard. If you cross this red line and you provide a weapon systems that we won't, and remember, Biden promised Putin that we would never deploy long range. When I say long range, I don't mean ICBM, but beyond the HIMARS capability, longer range ballistic missiles. We would never deploy them into Ukraine ever. That was a promise that was given, because that's a problem for Russia, and they're not going to let it happen. So I think that's what it means. Again, I can't speak on behalf of the Russian government. I don't know. That seems to be the kind of measured response. You don't respond by nuking Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
You respond by taking out the infrastructure in Europe that supports the vision of the ATACMS to the Ukrainians. That means that I believe one of the first targets taken out will be Ramstein Air Base.
And what way does that not lead to nuclear conflict?
I don't know.
Ramstein is one of the largest military bases in the world, correct?
It's a very large base, but the Russians, they photograph, they know what's going on, they know where the weapons land, they know where it's received. You take out the airfield, you take out the aircraft, you take out the support, you make it impossible for an airplane to land at Ramstein.
Do you believe?
Pardon?
I'm sorry to cut you off. Do you believe that the Russian strike would be able to get past NATO defenses, air defenses, missile defenses?
Kinzhal, baby.
Oh yeah,
it's past anything.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that doesn't happen. I don't.
No, and this is why the United States has come out and just flat out said no.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this reason I think yesterday just flat out said, nope, we ain't giving you the ATACMS, because we know what'll happen. It's not a secret. I mean, I'm not the only person in the world that sits there and says, where would Russia hit? Probably Ramstein Air Base. I think if I were still on active duty, that's what I'd be telling my bosses. Boss, they're going to take out Ramstein. And then you have to go to your political leadership and say, the potential consequence of deploying ATACMS to Ukraine is Ramstein gets taken out. What is our response? Well, we have to respond. So we're going to hit the units that hit Ramstein, because that's the logical thing. You find the unit that fired the missile and you take them out, cause and effect. but that unit is in Russia. So now we're going to attack Russia. In order to get to that place in Russia, we got to take out all the supporting air defense, because that's what the Russians did to us too. They didn't just take out Ramstein. All the Patriot missile batteries disappeared overnight. Boom, gone. And then we do that. The Russians come back and hit us. Boom, 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 boom. Next thing you know, it's general war, nuclear exchange. Goodbye. The world ends.
Yeah.
They know this, and that's why the answer they just gave was no, we're not going to give Ukraine the attack. So I think this is one of those problems that everybody should be aware of, everybody should be educated on, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
I wanted to move to the United Russia Party, which is, of course, the party that President Putin is a part of and the head of. They've proposed holding referendums in the newly captured, conquered, whatever word you want to use, regions of Ukraine. Do you think that makes sense now, or that makes more sense after the war?
Again, what makes sense to a Russian is far different than what makes sense to an American. And I don't mean that I'm not insulting anybody. Russia is Russia. It's got its own way of viewing things. When we speak of the American nation, we speak of our borders. We speak of the people in here. It's a melting pot, the American, but we tend to define the American nation as that defined by our borders. The contiguous 50 states, Alaska, Hawaii, or 49 states. Wow, marine math, I tell you, it's amazing. But the Russian nation is different. It's beyond the Russian Federation. The Russian nation is a cultural, historical, religious linkage that exists between Russians and non-Russians alike as part of this Russian nation. So in America, we don't comprehend that. We don't understand that. It's an algorithm that's not clicking in our brains. So that's why it's hard to say, is it right, et cetera. Here's the thing about the Russian nation. Vladimir Putin in 2005 gave a speech to the Federal Assembly. I think it was the State of the Nation speech, April 2005. And that's the one where he famously said one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the last century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. But they followed up by saying, because overnight tens of millions of Russian people were made homeless. And then he spoke about the Russian nation, and we're talking about all of the things that he's talking about, the cultural, the history, et cetera, that makes the Russian nation, that goes beyond. He said, my job isn't just to defend the Federation, the Russian people, it's to defend the Russian nation, which is inclusive of Ukraine, Belarus, et cetera. And that's a big deal. And then there's also the issue of is that your cat?
That's my dog. She wants attention. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I thought Maverick was the only dog that disrupted things. Yay, puppies. But no, the thing is, so the Russian nation is a big deal. When Putin spoke on February 21st and on February 24th in his lead-up addresses to the special military operation, he invoked the imagery of the Russian nation. He spoke how important it was that this special military operation was about defending the Russian nation. Here's a couple things. One, Kharkov was part of the Russian nation, Kharkov Oblast. The people that were under Russian control were the Russian nation. Russia just abandoned the crap out of these people. The Russian military in its rapid withdrawal, yes, they got a lot of people out. They abandoned a lot of people, and they're paying a heavy price right now. A sickening fact, there's a guy named Gary Tabak. He's a U.S. Navy captain. Bit of disclosure, he doesn't like me. That's okay. A lot of people don't like me. I'm not worried about it. But if in case anybody Googles him, they'll find out, oh, he doesn't like Scott. And maybe Scott's trying to pick on him. I'm not. Not for that. But this is a guy, if you take a look at his website, he has an American flag, like yours, in the background. But over it, he's draped the right sector flag. Put the right sector flag over the American flag. This is a guy who was present in Odessa in May of 2014 with right sector. Now, I'm not accusing him of any crime, but right sector put 150 Russians into a building, set on fire, and burned to death 84 of them. So my dog's turn to disrupt. That tells you where his mind is. He just gave an interview where he talked about bragging about how the Ukrainians were now hunting down the collaborators and killing them.
Mm-hmm.
hunting them down and killing. This is a Navy captain, a retired Navy captain, U.S. military officer, who's bragging about Ukrainian government revenge on uh, collaborators with Russia. Anybody who voluntarily worked with the Russians while the Russians were in control are collaborators. Apparently, the penalty is death. And we've seen imagery coming out of Kharkov now of freshly killed bodies. So, here the Russian president and the Russian leadership talks about protecting the Russian nation. They just abandoned the Russian nation in Kharkov, abandoned it. And now you want to talk about a referendum in Kherson? Well, the Russian nation in Kherson, how much confidence do they have right now that this is going to be permanent? Because if you do John Hancock, famously signed the Declaration of Independence with his big signature because in doing so, he condemned himself to death. That if they lost this gambit for independence, every signature on that page was somebody that was going to be taken and hung by the neck until dead for betraying the crown. Anybody who votes in this referendum participates in it is viewed as a traitor by the Ukrainian government. What has Russia done to convince the Russian nation of Ukraine that they're there forever, that they're going to win, that they're going to prevail? What is the vision? Russia has a hell of a lot of talking to do to the Russian nation. What's going on in Odessa? Do you want it or don't you want it? Kharkov, are you coming back or are not you coming back? Dnipropetrovsk, what's going to happen there? What is the Russian nation? Putin talked about the Russian nation, the need to protect the nation, and yet this special military operation has taken a Ukrainian government that already had issues with its ethnic Russian population. And now they've gone hard right anti-Russian. Listen to the laws coming out of Ukraine. Banning Russian language, banning Russian culture, banning Russian history, banning anything Russian, everything Russian, burning books, banning movies. Now, close your eyes, eliminate the word Russia, insert the word Jew. And Ukraine has become Nazi Germany, literally. And they're running pogroms right now. They're killing Russians. Russians are viewed as animals. The orcs. Okay, this isn't a game. This isn't exaggeration. This is real. We created the United States by funding it. Russia created by provoking it. But what the world has created in Ukraine is a modern day version of the same hate-filled, ultranationalistic, racially biased, Nazi type ideology that we thought we eradicated with Adolf Hitler. But it's alive and well and living in Ukraine today. And by empowering these people, by mainstreaming this anti-Russian, not just rhetoric, but policies and actions, this is a direct threat to the Russian nation that has to be dealt with. It's a boil that must be lanced if you say we believe in the Russian nation, if you define it the way Vladimir Putin did. So I would tell the Russia First Party, before you talk about a referendum, talk about what your vision is for Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Educate us first. How are you going to protect the Russian nation? Are you going to protect the people to vote in the referendum? How about if I'm somebody in Crimea right now? Is Russia here for good? Or are they just faking it? I mean, I need to know. So there's a lot of explaining that needs to be done. If I were the Russians, and I'm not, but I would hold off on the referendum until I've properly defined what my post-conflict reality is going to look like. What is my strategic vision for helping the Russian nation? How are Russians of the Russian nation who reside in Ukraine going to be protected? What guarantees are they going to be given? Because here's the weakness part. Here's the risk. If Russia yields on the issue of Ukraine and allows the Russian nation in Ukraine to be subjugated, tortured, murdered, raped, whatever, by Ukrainians, over in the Baltics, we have 3 republics that are as equally Nazi-oriented as the Ukrainians. You scratch an Estonian, you scratch a Latvian, you scratch a Lithuanian, you have a Nazi. They worship these guys. They fought for them. They slaughtered Jews on behalf of them. They were never denazified. They're there. They're alive. They're willing. And they're taking the lead off of Ukraine. And if Ukraine suddenly emerges as this Nazi regime where slaughtering everything Russia is A-OK and Russia's not going to do a damn thing about it, trust me, the Russian nation and the Baltics aren't safe either. So I think this is one of these, this is where it becomes existential in nature. Putin has defined this conflict using the imagery of the Russian nation. And I think he needs to tighten that down. I think he needs to explain to the Russian nation, to the Russian people, and indeed to the world, what he means by that. And I think that would have to come first before a referendum, because otherwise you're putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, the Nazism you're talking about is becoming so widespread, and it's incredibly dangerous. You even see it online. You have a lot of people, prominent people who like to call themselves anti-racist and they're anti-discriminatory and all that, but then they're willing to call Russians orcs and they're willing to get behind killing all Russians and things like that. It's completely absurd and hypocritical and extremely dangerous. Like you're saying, it's like the lead up to World War II, what we saw in Germany in the 30s. Yeah.
Well, it's also unleashing, again, we touched on this, but the danger of the special military operation in Ukraine right now is that it is unleashing the forces of extreme nationalism. Look, the Russian leadership has to be very careful because nationalism isn't good. Extreme nationalism, unconstrained nationalism is not good in any way, shape, or form. And this conflict is starting to be defined in Russia as a nationalist conflict. And that creates a whole bunch of psychological factors that affect how the Russian people will interact with the rest of the world. You know, there's already a lot of talk right now, and you see it on social media, where Russians are just basically they hate the West. They don't trust the West, and I understand why. I'm not pretending that there's not justification, but I have to tell you that if you ever want a diplomatic off ramp from this conflict towards bettering relations, this ultra nationalism is going to make that much more difficult because it creates a political reality that Russian leadership has to deal with when putting forward policies on how to improve relations with the West. The Russian people will have to want to improve relations with the West in order for there to be better relations with the West. And right now, this nationalism is out of control. The nationalism in Poland is empowering them to think that they can demand reparations from Germany. Nationalism in Germany, I mean, when Schultz says, I want to build the most powerful military Germany has ever had, he might as well go, I want to build the most powerful military Germany ever had. I mean, because that's what he's becoming, Adolf Hitler. No, Germany doesn't deserve a powerful military. I'm sorry. You guys had that once. No more.
Twice.
You can be a powerful economy, but you don't get to be a powerful military. And if I were the president of the United States, I'd call him up and say, if you want a big problem with America, continue on this path because we're not going to let you become, the Fourth Reich. That's not going to happen, Schultz. You don't get to be a military power in Europe. I'm sorry. You didn't earn that right. You lost the war, and you've still lost the war. We're not going to let you suddenly win the war. And that's harsh, but it's true. Germany is a potential cancer in the middle of Europe, and giving Germany a large military and then creating the conditions where that military can orient to the east to go through Poland. And we did this once before. We don't need to do it again. And if they're starting to talk about redrawing the map in Poland, saying Silesia is once against Germany, then what happens when you orient to the west and you start looking at Strasbourg and you start looking at areas in France that the Germans like to believe belong to them? What happens when the Germans start to look towards Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland? Ah, yes, and you get this nice German accent. Then you grow the mustache, and next thing you know, you're wearing black uniforms with swastikas on them. So no, it doesn't. The United States again has to take a leadership role. The reason why all of this is happening is because we've allowed chaos to engender itself into Europe. We need to step in and shut this thing down, or else it's just going to spin out of control. Really.
Yeah, I mean, we know this winter is going to be catastrophic, especially if it's freezing. We're gonna, what happens if these EU countries fall apart, if they fall out of the EU, and now we have, like you're saying, we have Germany who's making a bigger military, and what if Germany wants that Sudetenland? What if Germany wants parts of France? I mean, we could easily see Europe spiral into continent-wide conflict.
Once the glue comes off, you don't know how the structure is going to collapse. The glue is coming off.
Hmm.
This is the question again. I'm all these foreign policy people and these generals. We need to start conceptualizing what this looks like after Russia loses. Russia ain't going to lose.
Yeah.
I really think all this brain power should be looking at what happens when the European Union collapses. What happens when NATO falls into fratricidal, conflict? What happens? These are the questions they need to start asking when when the sanctions, when the results of the sanctions fully hit, and you have economies shutting down, you have people freezing, you have riots in the street. What's Europe going to look like after this? And if you can't answer that question, and this is always the important thing, if you're allowing something to happen and you can't tell me what the end game is going to be, what it's going to look like, then maybe we shouldn't allow it to happen. Maybe we should step in and keep it to what we know, what we understand, what we can deal with, which is the present. Europe can still be preserved right now. Ukraine should not be allowed to dictate the future of Europe. Should not. Ukraine, again, I gotta be careful what I say, but because it's very sensitive, but it's in many ways it's an artificial construct, an accident of history. And I'm not saying that Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist. I'm saying that Ukraine in its current configuration doesn't deserve to exist. No neo-Nazi affiliated regime deserves to exist. And when you have targeted 1/3 of your population as subhuman, calling them orcs, you don't deserve to exist. When you have another third of your population embracing the ideology of Stepan Bandera, elevating him to the status of national hero, no. So Ukraine is a broken nation, fundamentally broken nation. Why Europe is committing suicide to preserve a broken nation is beyond me. I'm not saying 100% that Vladimir Putin's historical understanding of Ukraine is right. I'm sure there could be pushback on many areas, but he's closer to the truth than Europe is. And maybe we need to let Russia and Ukraine sort this thing out. But no, we're stepping in the middle of it and we're allowing Ukraine to become an issue that will destroy Europe. And that's just wrong.
It seems pretty clear that's going to happen when Europe falls, collapses, whatever you want to say. And NATO probably. What is the U.S. going to do? We have so much hardware over there at Ramstein and various other bases, even nuclear missiles, I believe. What are we going to do with all that?
Well, we don't have nuclear. We have B-61 bombs, air
Okay.
deliverable bombs. Well, this is again the $1 million question that people, Rand Corporation should be working on this problem with the same enthusiasm that they published their 2019 study on how to dismember, to create disarray in Russia. Everybody should be asking this question. The United States does not have sufficient military infrastructure in Europe to hold Europe together by force. We might have been able to do that back in the 1970s and 1980s. We can't do it today. And when a nation decides they no longer want America there, then America's not going to be there. Germany says, auf Wiedersehen, goodbye. It's auf Wiedersehen, goodbye. We have to go. We can't say, no, we refuse to leave. We're going to stay in Ramstein. Well, that's going to be suicidal for whoever's there. So, the United States doesn't have the ability to immediately impose its will. What are we going to do? Go through general mobilization here in the United States to build a military that we can then transport across the Atlantic to what? Invade Europe and hold Europe? No, that's not going to happen. We have in place today structures, European Union and NATO, which are very oriented towards America and serving America's interests. It's in our interest to preserve these structures. Now, some of our policies have created conditions which weaken these structures. So we need to re-examine these policies. Number one policy of which needs to be re-examined is the long-held belief that if Russian energy is in Europe, this creates a national security crisis for Europe. That was always a hypothetical that was unproven. Let me give you a proven hypothesis. If Russian energy is denied to Europe, Europe ceases to exist. That is a provable point. We're proving it as we speak. So I would advise the United States to find a way to keep Europe from falling apart by encouraging Russian energy to come in. Um, that would be in the best interest. Yeah, you solve almost every problem instantly overnight. If you're happy with the current political elite that's in Europe, then turn on Nord Stream 2, get Siemens pumps delivered to Nord Stream 1, and make the energy crisis go away. Stop sanctioning Russian energy. That is the solution. It's the most obvious solution out there. Um, to end this crisis, because one thing you'll do, I mean, this is the irony of ironies. Let's say because everybody's like, well, damn, Russia just made an extra $30 billion last quarter. They're making more money now than they were before. The sanctions have backfired. Okay, you're right, because it's stupid. You don't understand Russian energy. You don't understand global energy security. You want to know how you get Russia to stop making money? You really want to complicate Russia's life right now? Because Russia's in the middle of this economic transformation, going from west to east. You want to play with their minds? You want to play with the economy? Turn on Nord Stream 2. Watch gas prices plummet. And suddenly Russia's not making as much money as they used to be. Because Russia's a prisoner to the to the global economy. And then you really want to screw with Russia? Buy everything in rubles.
Why would that affect them negatively?
First of all, you're going to start. Russia's going to have to start printing rubles. Mm-hmm. Because there ain't enough rubles right now. So Russia, in order to meet the global demand, they're going to have to come up with something they're not designed to come up with. Russia linked the ruble to the gold standard, which means there's a finite amount of gold. How do you dilute that? You turn to the Russians and say, I'm going to grant your wish, brother. Buy all your energy. We're paying it in rubles. We're doing it. But you don't have enough rubles? You don't have enough rubles? Huh. See, we can devalue the ruble. We can, a word I'm not allowed to say. We can mess with the ruble. Russia's not invulnerable. We've allowed Russia to create this fortress Russia that's very difficult to attack, not because Russia's done anything, because we've made it impossible to attack. Lift the sanctions, get the energy flowing, get the ruble in a state of flux, and then start screwing with the Russian economy by engaging with the Russian economy. When you create, you've simplified Russia's economic reality by creating this wall, because Russia no longer has to worry about the complexities of the Western economy. They're now focused on integrating with the Eastern economy. Insert Western competition into that framework to dilute some of the impact that the East connectivity is going to make, and you're complicating the situation for the Russians. I'm not saying Russia's not going to be able to get out of it. I'm just saying that you're complicating it. It's a control mechanism if you want to slow down this transition away from an American hegemony towards a multipolarity. And I'm saying this wearing my American hat. Now, I'm not saying that I believe in this. I'm just saying, what could America do? The quickest solution to all the problems that confront us is literally to turn back on all the energy connectivity with the West. It's first of all, you stabilize Europe overnight. Overnight, you stabilize Europe. The European economy will become very strong, and then things happen that Russia has to worry about. Germany can now afford that big army, and things of that nature. So, but we're not going to do that, and so all we're doing is guaranteeing that Russia's going to come out of this a winner. Winner, chicken dinner, baby. Russia, and they don't even have to work at it. Maybe this is our 5D chess, because Russia spent so many decades building up this very efficient bureaucracy because they had to deal with a very complex world where they were in a confrontational stance with the United States. So maybe our 5D chess is we're going to simplify Russia so we dumb them down, so they become like us, stupid, lethargic, complacent. And then we spring the trap on them and say, no, it's really a complicated world. You're not really. I'm joking here. I'm being facetious. My point is, I don't know what our strategy is. We don't have a strategy. So that's that. I think we gotta come close to wrapping this up because I've got another commitment. But
Yeah.
I'll continue to ask. You can ask like a couple more questions, but then we got to go.
One theory I've had for about a week or so now is that Russia may want to extend this conflict in Ukraine a bit longer than you'd think they'd want to because gas prices are so high right now. They're making so much money selling gas, selling oil. Do you agree with that? Do you think that maybe?
Yeah, no, I think. Look, I think Russia wanted to win this war quickly.
Yeah,
Special military operation. I think the phase one operation was designed basically to put some sort of shock and awe on Ukraine and get it to collapse. That didn't happen. I then think Russia believed that phase two would go better than it did, but they've run into the reality of $53 billion worth of aid. Um, that's a big mountain you got to climb now. So now Russia realizes they're not going to get this thing done by the fall, and and Russia's been very mature about not putting artificial calendar-driven timelines on here. We have to, I remember the Mariupol, all the armchair experts. Russia needs to take Mariupol by Victory Day because Putin will be embarrassed if he can't get up there and say, we have won Mariupol. Putin didn't care. Putin had his parade. He did what he wanted. The military is going to take Mariupol when Mariupol falls to the military campaign. No artificial timelines. But that means that now Russia, by fighting this war in a way that preserves Russian life, they're looking at the reality that this is going to extend into the winter. And this is where Russia accrues a lot of advantages. I don't think that Russia intended for this thing to last winter, but it now looks at it's going to. So I think we're going to see more or less an operational pause. I mean, they'll be fighting. Don't get me wrong, but no, I don't think we're going to see decisive fighting in Ukraine. Watch Russia launch a major offensive in November and win the war, and everybody say, Ritter, you were wrong again. Okay, so what? But I don't think we're going to see Russia launching a major offensive this winter because Russia is going to accrue so many benefits from the bad policies of Europe. Russia, one of their strategic objectives is to negotiate a new European security framework with Europe that deals with the retrograde of NATO infrastructure back to 1997 lines, et cetera. Russia tried to promote this in December of last year, ignored by the United States and NATO. And I think Russia realizes that if the United States and NATO emerge intact or somehow emboldened by Ukraine, that the likelihood of them changing their minds and suddenly having a new think about this is zero. But if Europe is collapsing, NATO is fracturing, et cetera, the United States and European gap is greater, Russia can emerge from the winter with a military victory in the spring and the summer, and a position where the next time it approaches Europe about a new European security framework, Europe might be in a better position to say, yeah, we would do that if it leads to some widespread stability, because Europe's going to be desperate for stability, and a new European security framework that's sold as a vehicle of stabilization might be more readily received. So I think Russia is looking at the coming winter as a force multiplier, and it also helps them economically on the global stage. This transition that Putin and Xi talked about on February 4th, they signed their 5,000-word joint statement about, the end of the rules-based international order and the emergence of a law-based international order, one that is founded on the principles of the United Nations Charter, one that is not based upon a unipolarity reality of American hegemony, but rather a multipolarity reality of multiple nations, including America, that work together to achieve, some sort of global stability. They're transitioning towards that. It's becoming a reality, and this winter is going to help accelerate some of things, because the collapse of Europe means the collapse of the G7, the collapse of the World Bank, the collapse of the International Monetary Fund. All these institutions that underpin the rules-based international order are likewise going to collapse. And that's Russia's strategic objective. So I think this winter is going to be very, very decisive. The level of the Russian victory will be determined by the temperature. The colder it is, the greater the Russian victory. The warmer it is, the less the Russian victory would be. But either way, Russia, no matter what, is going to emerge from this in a very, very strong position.
Yeah. I have one more question if you have the time, and I just have one statement before that question. Vladimir Putin was speaking the other day, and he talked about the demonstrators in Germany demanding that Nord Stream 2 be certified and activated. And Putin essentially, he didn't say it, but he implied that, if Germany were to take the sanctions away and they were to, essentially not necessarily apologize, but to apologize to Russia, then Russia would let the gas flow through Nord Stream 2. So it's up to Germany, is my point. It's up to Europe. They have to stop following in the United States footsteps. They have to be independent. They have to be Europe for Europeans if they want to have a future. My last question is, you mentioned the new European security framework. What do you think that would look like? Just like generally speaking, obviously that's a massive question. We don't have time for it, but just in general.
Yeah. Let me start on your statement just to make a comment. You know, America has been the worst parent in the world. I mean, we gave birth to Europe after World War II. We birthed it. We've been raising it. And this is like me being a parent, looking at my 30-year-old child saying, "Why aren't you out of the damn basement out getting a job?" But I never let them leave the basement. I never let them get a job. And suddenly I want to tell them to grow up. It doesn't work that way. Effective parenting is from very early stage transferring responsibility from the parent to the child as the child transitions into adulthood so that the child become a functioning member of society. The United States has never allowed Europe, Germany, anybody else to be a functioning member of society. They've always been subservient. So it's very difficult to talk about Europe suddenly growing up. But in emergencies, people mature quickly, and so do nations. And I think there's going to be a lot of emergencies this winter, and let's see how Europe responds. Are they just going to cower in the corner of mommy's basement and cry, or are they going to actually man up, woman up, step up, and assert themselves? European security framework. Again, this is just purely me speaking on what I think. I go back to the last time the Soviet Union and NATO and the United States looked at this. What were some of the important elements? One was it's a treaty-based relationship, which means binding law, which means elements of mutually binding compliance verification. That it's trust but verify. So that has to be an important part of it. So that means that we have to start codifying relationships back in terms of treaties. Back in the Cold War, we started off with we had the INF Treaty. From the INF Treaty came START. From START came CFE, became Open Skies. Basically, it's this framework of security that defined things. It was reciprocal in nature, codified. Everybody knew what to expect. That model is going to have to be brought in. I do believe that if Russia emerges from Ukraine victorious, as I believe they will, and NATO weakened, here's the danger. Russia's strength will be perceived as a threat by Europe, and then Europe is going to be spending as much time as possible countering that strength. And we've replicated the Cold War buildup of conventional military power in Europe. Very dangerous situation. So it's in Russia's best interest. And this is another reason why general mobilization is not attractive. These contract volunteers that they're going to build up to come in to solve the SMO problem. The beauty of that is the contracts can be limited to the SMO, meaning that when the special military operation is over, they can be rapidly demobilized, returned to civil society, and Russia's left with the military that it has today, which is less threatening than a bigger, expanded military. But Russia is going to have to, I believe, work with Europe to. What you want to do is find a way to get Russia's power to be drawn down and keep Europe's power from going too far up. So you're going to have to find this balance. And you do that with a new conventional forces in Europe treaty. You do that with a treaty that creates, it's not going to be a zone of neutrality. It will be a zone of diminished military capacity. and then Russia will keep sufficient forces on this zone to guarantee border security and things of that nature. But the major forces might have to draw deeper into the Russian interior. The same thing, NATO infrastructure will have to be drawn back to 1997 lines. But now you're going to de-emphasize the military buildup, et cetera. Nuclear weapons have to be removed from the situation altogether. So you need to reinstate the INF treaty, and it has to be binding for all parties. And the United States is going to have to, when we talk about nuclear disarmament, the United States is going to have to be willing to do two things. One, insist that French and British nuclear forces be a part of this. So far, they've been able to set off separately. No, you're in on this. It was difficult to do in the old days, but with this new reality that's going to emerge, I think that might be the case. And the U.S. is going to have to get rid of its B-61 bombs. They're going to have to remove from it this whole nuclear posture where we provide bombs on nuclear nations, so that if Germany has an F-35 fighter, that used to be the Tornado, that they got to deliver nuclear weapons as a NATO nuclear deterrent, but it's really an American nuclear bomb on a German plane. That's over. That way, if Finland wants to buy F-35A fighters, Russia doesn't have to worry about those fighters because they're already adapted to carry nuclear bombs, suddenly having nuclear bombs on them to deliver nuclear missions. You take the nuclear bombs the hell out of the equation, the F-35 just becomes a very expensive piece of junk. And that, so I think that's that. Ballistic missile defense. I think we have to reinstitute the ABM treaty, at least in a European context. These ballistic missile defense systems that are currently installed in Romania and in Poland have to go away. That would be part of the reduction of NATO infrastructure. And that has to be for both parties. Russia has developed some very effective anti-ballistic missile capabilities, and Russia's going to have to put those on the table as well. That's just a statement of fact. So Russia's going to have to, there's going to have to be some, give and take, but Russia's going to have to be able to put some stuff on the table as well. But I think by reinstituting an INF treaty, an ABM treaty, and a CFE treaty in a new context. It can be one singular treaty. It can be three separate components, whatever. But if you do all of that, you now have a European security framework that de-emphasizes military conflict, makes it virtually impossible for there to be a general war between, and now Europe and Russia can begin the process, a very lengthy process of rebuilding relationships. But the key aspect of rebuilding relationships is trust, and trust can only exist in an environment where there's reciprocal obligations that can be verified through effective compliance monitoring regimes, all treaty-based.
So would NATO wouldn't be involved in this anymore? Would NATO be disbanded?
No, NATO. I think from Russia's perspective, to be honest, you want NATO involved.
Mm-hmm.
Because NATO is a linchpin of European security and stability. What you want to do, though, is refocus NATO's mission statement from being one of a singular focus on building up to oppose a Russian threat. NATO's new statement is working cooperatively with Russia to reduce the threat. But you need NATO. You need that connectivity. You need the singularity of mind that it brings to it. And Russia's never said we want NATO to be dismantled. Russia just simply said we don't want NATO on our border.
Yeah. Well, that's all I have. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, again, thank you very mumuch. I always appreciate talking with you. I know it goes long and people probably rolling their eyes, but you're very well prepared. You ask great questions, and it's a very relaxed environment. With your dog and my dog in the background, I think we've established puppy domination. So but thanks again for having me. I really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you coming on.
Okay. Well, have a great day.
You too.
And send me a link when you can. I'll put it up for you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.